Welcome to Women Challenging Expectations. I'm Richard Sheaf, the current president of the Ephemera Society of America. Each year for decades now, the Ephemera Society has put on a conference on topics of cultural or historical interest, featuring speakers who use ephemera to enlighten their presentations. This year, our conference is being offered online with 4 presentations today and 4 different additional presentations tomorrow. We believe that our conference this year, Women Challenging Expectations, is especially strong and particularly relevant to current cultural awarenesses, as well as to the fact that this is Women's History Month. We sincerely thank each of you for participating. The Ephemera Society of America is a nonprofit organization formed 40 years ago. Our members are collectors, curators, museums and other institutions, and researchers. Our mission is to cultivate and encourage interest in ephemera and in history, and to serve as an umbrella organization for collectors, dealers, institutions, and scholars. A definition of ephemera, for those of you who may not be familiar with the term, can be found on our website, ephemerasociety.org. In a nutshell, ephemera are printed or written items which were created to serve some specific purpose and were not expected to be retained or preserved, but which for one reason or another have been. It turns out that ephemera provides rich primary source historical and social information. Our website, ephemerasociety.org, offers full information about the society and about ephemera in general, as well as many online exhibits and blog stories. We invite one and all to spend some time there. Today, we will enjoy 4 interesting presentations. Our first and keynote speaker, Lisa Baskin, will dispel the notion that a woman's place was always traditionally in the home, unless she happened to work as a teacher or as a nurse. Lisa is a political activist, collector, book dealer, and antiquarian who jokes that she began collecting in the cradle. She spent decades assembling a comprehensive collection documenting the political and social history of working women from the 15th century to the Spanish Civil War. That collection has been placed at the David M. Rubenstein Library, the Rubenstein Library at Duke University. Then Caroline Preston, author of 5 novels and a longtime friend, will present Sylvia Beach, a 1920s feminist icon in Paris who, among other things, dared to publish James Joyce's banned novel Ulysses. Her Shakespeare and Company bookshop became the regular hangout of the likes of Hemingway, Ezra Pound, and Gertrude Stein. I might add that Caroline was amongst the first class of women to integrate a formerly all-men's college. Following Caroline, Jenny Waldau, currently working on her PhD at Stanford University, will take us into the world of 1960s and 1970s visual and performance arts. She will discuss arts activist Lucy Lippard, a prominent writer, curator, and organizer. Finally today, Heidi, Herr, outreach librarian for special collections at Johns Hopkins University, and 2 of her undergraduate students at Johns Hopkins, will address the 19th Amendment and aspects of women's suffrage. The Young Scholars presentation has become a much appreciated aspect of our annual conference presentations and is an important component of the Society's commitment to our younger generations. Without much more ado, a couple points. During these presentations, each of you may come and go as you like. If you are unable to remain in attendance throughout the entire time and must leave for a bit, you can simply log back in at any time using the same link. The support of our patrons and donors, and now you online participants, is particularly important to us. Our annual in-person conference provides regular income that allows us to pursue our missions. Now, online, we are offering presentations without any fee requirement. Please do consider going to ephemerasociety.org and clicking the appropriate support link to make a donation in whatever amount you choose. Continuing financial support is critical to us. We would especially like to acknowledge and offer a heartfelt thank you to our corporate sponsor, Swan Auction Galleries. Finally, a couple of points about the mechanics of today's presentations. Please, if you wish to submit questions for the Q&A sessions to follow each talk, use the Q&A function on Zoom, not the chat function. Society board member Mike Pike will be monitoring all Q&A questions and will pass along as many as possible to each speaker following each talk. Also, the raise hand function will not be activated today. Again, not chat, not raise hand. Thank you. So here we go. Our keynote speaker today is Lisa Baskin, who will be talking with us about the history of women in the workplace. It will be our great fortune today to have a chance to see a portion of the thousands of fabulous, relevant items of ephemera Lisa gathered together over many years of dedicated huntering and gathering. Lisa, take it away.
Thank you, Dick. I will begin my talk by acknowledging that I stand today on Nonotuck land. I would also like to acknowledge our neighboring indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohegan to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. Thank you, Dick Sheaf, Barbara Lowe, and the board of the Ephemera Society of America for organizing this conference, persisting through these impossibly difficult times, and managing to schedule this, the 40th conference of the Ephemera Society of America. The theme, Women Challenging Expectations, was chosen in recognition and celebration of the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, granting American women the right to vote. And in this context, and on this anniversary, we must acknowledge that the world of collecting has historically been very white and a very male one. Women are, to this day, still excluded from two significant bibliophilic organizations, Boston's Club of Odd Volumes and Cleveland's Rofant Club. The Grolier Club, which did not admit women until 1976, now has members who are women and people of color. Ephemera, those often throwaway remnants of paper, has played a consequential part in revealing the breadth and variety of vocations that women have pursued to earn a living. The notion that women have not worked outside their homes, except in the traditional roles assigned to them, such as teaching or nursing, is challenged by the physical evidence that exists, chronicling the scope of their participation in vocations that we assume were closed to them. Often documented by a single ephemeral bit of evidence, we now understand that women participated in myriad vocations, and their work made significant contributions throughout the centuries. How is it possible to demonstrate and reveal in some small way the breadth and variety of the work that women were engaged with throughout history without these bits of evidence? My exhibition, 500 Years of Women's Work, held last year at the Grolier Club and Duke University's Rubenstein Library, was for many a revelation. That exhibition and my talk today focus on Western European and American women. It is a shortcoming due to my own limitations. Working women's tracks are often invisible. One needs eyes and a single-minded focus to ferret them out. The women I am interested in worked in a society that often did not value them or the work they managed to do to earn a living. As they do today, women frequently struggled to work with the additional burdens of raising a family, bearing and often burying numerous children. Inequality is not always visible. Education was denied to women. Enslaved people, including women, were forbidden to learn to read. Women were not granted access to higher education on an equal basis with men. Still, they managed to overcome enormous barriers. The need to earn a living transcended these obstacles. In the 1960s, I began to collect the history of working women. Literary women held little allure to me. My collection consists of printed books, manuscripts, photographs, pamphlets, and a quite significant amount of ephemera dating from the 12th to the 20th century. In 2015, my collection of approximately 16,000 items moved to its now permanent home at Duke University's Rubenstein Library, where for the past number of years, it is being cataloged and made available to students, researchers, activists, and community members. This conference was originally scheduled last year during the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, granting suffrage to women. We decided that I would still begin my talk with a number of images relating to the struggle of women to achieve the vote. 6 centuries of working women will follow these initial slides. This is a suffrage banner of the WSPU from Ilford. This great banner, about 8 feet long, was made by 3 sisters, Dorothy, Maud, and Monica Harvey. The Women's Social and Political Union was a militant organization believing in direct action to achieve the vote. Justice hung in my library, the overarching theme of my work and collection. The reverse says no taxation without representation. This banner was carried in the Great London Suffrage Demonstration in June 1910, which was one of the earliest mass marches organized to achieve the vote. Suffragists and suffragettes. On the left, suffragettes were members of the WSPU, the radical part of the movement. They espoused violent means to achieve the vote. On the left is an issue of the journal, Votes for Women. It was published by the WSPU, as I said, and the suffrage flyer on the right proclaims itself non-militant. It states that their supporters are women who support achieving the vote by constitutional means. In the center, Beware, a Warning for Suffragists, is a satiric poem mocking the suffragists. Part of the verse, don't earn your living if you can, have it earned for you by a man. Militant suffragette Rosa May Billinghurst was a member of the Women's Social and Political Union. A childhood illness had paralyzed her from the waist down. She was known as the crippled suffragette. She campaigned riding on a hand-powered tricycle and in a wheelchair. Billinghurst founded and led the Greenwich branch of the WSPU and participated in window smashing, hunger strikes, and other types of direct action. She was arrested several times and force-fed on at least one occasion. The printed certificate from the WSPU, signed by Emmeline Pankhurst and Emmeline Pethick Lawrence, was designed by Sylvia Pankhurst, artist and militant activist, incorporating the Angel of Freedom and a jail portrait, other various symbols of the suffrage movement. And this was presented to suffragettes upon their release from jail. On the right, Emily Wilding Davison, a militant suffragette and hunger striker, set fire to post boxes, and she was jailed for 6 months and force-fed. The image on the right is the program from her funeral. She died at age 41, trampled by the King's horse at Epsom, Derby, though it might not have been her intent to commit suicide, but to place suffrage colors onto the King's horse. Tragically, she was killed. At her funeral, 50,000 people lined the streets. These objects are about as ephemeral as they can be, approximately 18 inches wide. These oversized napkins were printed on crepe paper. Many were printed by Sarah Burgess of York Place off the Strand, who supplied swag for numerous London demonstrations and elsewhere. They commemorate 2 demonstrations. The one on the right, June 21st, 1908, shows the demonstration route through London. On the left, commemorating the non-militant Mud March of February 9th, 1907, It was the first large demonstration, first large suffrage demonstration in London. News of the World, this oversized placard on the left, which is about 2 to 3 feet tall, lists the headlines for the Sunday, October 28th issue in 1906. 3 days earlier, 150 WSPU members had arrived at Westminster, each asking to see a member of Parliament. Only 20 were admitted. And during the conflict that followed, 10 suffragettes were arrested, later convicted, and sentenced to 2 months in a Holloway jail. As they hoped, the sentences made the newspapers. On the right is a New York State poster, Vote Yes, printed to get out the vote for the suffrage referenda held in Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania on the 2nd of November in 1915. The posters were printed by the Empire State Campaign Committee and hung in New York City's theaters. Sojourner Truth, the cabinet card, portrays Sojourner Truth, the great itinerant preacher, political activist, abolitionist, and suffragist. Formerly enslaved, Truth addressed the 1851 Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. The only true account of Truth's speech was written and published by her friend Marius Robinson in the Anti-Slavery Bugle, not the inaccurate one published 12 years later by Frances Dana Gage. We now know that the newspaper article by Gage was written 12 years after Truth gave her speech. Truth did not have a Southern accent. With the now easy accessibility of photography, Sojourner Truth decided to have made and to sell photographs of herself, both cabinet cards and carte de visite. She chose how she wished to be portrayed: a shawl about her shoulders, a book, and her knitting. Her injured hand, carefully obscured in the photograph. The photos carried the caption, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." Photographs, after all, were less expensive to produce and significantly lighter to carry than copies of her narrative. Their sale helped to support her. We count among Truth's allies in the struggle for women's suffrage the novelist and poet Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who co-founded the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs with Victoria Earle Matthews, and the great journalist and activist Ida B. Wells. These are just two slides of various suffrage melange of flyers that relate to women's suffrage. Multiple stacks. I acquired multiple stacks of these from Avis and Rocky Gardner in the late 60s, along with the most complete run of the periodical The Revolution known. This is a composite of British and American objects and ephemera. The British sash on the upper left, colors are symbolic: purple for royalty, white purity, and green hope. The sash at the top is English. The one on the lower right, which has a cigarette burn if you look closely, is American. The upper left image is Ida B. Wells, the great Chicago journalist and anti-lynching activist. Wells founded the first suffrage organization for Black women, Chicago's Alpha Suffrage Club, in January 1913. There's a Votes for Women paper cup. The ribbon badge is from the 37th Annual Convention from the New York State Women's Suffrage Association, held in Rochester in 1905. It shows Susan B. Anthony, and on the reverse, perfect equality of rights for women. This is a photograph of the 4th grade class at the Roach Street School in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1896. The Black school teacher with her pupils. The school opened in 1891. It consisted of 4 classes in 4 rooms. It was located in the now historic Atlanta University area, but the building has alas been demolished amid significant community controversy. Jane Gilbert of Tokrington, this is a rent receipt. The vast majority of men in medieval times made their wives the executors of their wills. Women were trusted for their business skills and honesty. Jane Gilbert was likely a widow and managing either her own or her husband's property. Elizabeth Shorter of Philadelphia identified herself as a glover in London. She was a widow and a landowner. She emigrated to Philadelphia, to Pennsylvania. This deed documents the sale of Widow Shorter's housing in the front street of Delaware with my lot to Christopher Libthorpe for the sum of £100 sterling. It is signed with her mark, an X, and this document was written within 4 years of the founding of Philadelphia in 1682. Shorter was a glover in London. She moved to Pennsylvania with her grandson, Isaac Knight, somewhere around 1683. She was one of the first purchasers, that select group of 751 individuals who bought the initial offering of land from William Penn in 1682. Penn signed an indenture to her in London, and 2 years later, he signed an official land grant confirming the location and cost of her 250-acre plot. Exploiting her illiteracy, her son-in-law tried to defraud her out of all her property, having her sign over to him her land, chattels, leases, money, plate, household stuff, brass, etc. She went to the governing council in Philadelphia to contest the fraud, and she won the action in 1687. Short owned her land in Abington until 1699. This elegantly delicious engraved trade card, it's about 4 inches wide, illustrates the contents of Eleanor Ogle's shop. The engraving shows marvelous willow baskets called pottles, which are conically shaped to prevent strawberries from being bruised at the bottom of the cone. Pottles were made by women and children. It is likely that Eleanor Ogle's husband took her name, as her own business was well established before they married, and the business is later recorded solely in her name. Another example of this card exists. It's in the Heel collection at the British Museum. Elizabeth Herr made violins. A number of them survive. She also gave music lessons. The reverse is a manuscript receipt for the sale of strings. Herr took over her husband's shop around 1730. Her husband had been apprenticed to a woman instrument maker. Sarah Bellis on the top left was a tallow chandler. It was one of the earliest guilds to include women. It was founded around 1300. Tallow chandlers also sold sauces, vinegar, and animal fat, which was important in the making of soap. Bellis kept a successful shop, as reflected in this bill. A number of instances, this is an aside, a number of instances of adulterated candles were being sold. They were made from animal fat, not beeswax. But the sellers were, turns out, were widows, and they were let off without jail or fines. Margaret Grant, the brush maker, sales receipt on both sides, including a mahogany tray. A brush maker makes and sells all sorts of ship and house brushes, brooms, mops, and hair sieves. They advertised ready money for good beeswax, hog's hair, and horsehair. She also sold all sorts of Dutch and English toys. On the right, Mary Hornby and Susanna Harris were hoop makers. Clearly, hoop making was a highly competitive market. As noted on the page, hoop and petticoat makers, the real successors to Mrs. Moody. Mrs. Phillips was in the highly competitive market of condom manufacturers and sellers. She describes in great detail the physical location of her business, so not to be confused with a competitor who was infringing on her territory. Her marketing was specific and targeted. To captains of ships and gentlemen, etc., going abroad, they may be supplied with any quantity of the best goods on the shortest notice. She manufactured her goods using only the finest bladders and skins. To guard yourself from shame or fear, votaries to Venus hasten here. None in our wares e'er found a flaw. Self-preservation, nature's law. Mrs. B was a mantua maker. Mantua was a loose-fitting gown. However, being a mantua maker was clearly a cover. She is an astrologer, continuing to answer all lawful questions of love, etc., things else that can be answered by the celestial science. Mrs. B made house calls. Ladies waited on at home, morning or evening. Questions answered from 10 in the morning till 8 at night. A very long day. I've long been interested in the role women played in both the production and the selling of books. My collection encompasses women printers, dating from incunables, which are the earliest books printed from movable type, to Elizabeth Corbett Yates's Cooler Press. The word incunable is derived from the word cradle. Women typographers, illuminators, bookbinders, and booksellers are all represented in the collection. Women have actively participated in the bookselling and printing trades since the invention of movable type. Printing tended to be a family business. I posit that it was likely that women from Gutenberg's family were even setting type in his shop. Their nimble fingers, of course, set type and sewed folios for binding. And of course, women sold books. Women, however, were not permitted to take up printing apprenticeships. This section reflects that interest. We will not, however, see any images of books, but only the quite scarce historical tracts that were made visible through ephemera. In Japan in the 7th century, Empress Xiao Toku ordered printed paper charms to be printed for all Buddhist temples, monasteries, and households. A very elusive bit of ephemera. Alas, I did not have one. In Tuscany, outside of Florence at Ripoli, nuns ran a printing press at San Jacopo from 1478, where they composed type, rubricated books, and financially supported the press. I will not show examples of their books. No images of 16th and 17th century books that were central to my collection. But happily, on occasion, I've been fortunate to find some ephemeral evidence of women in the book trades. Elizabeth Hutchinson, this was very well hidden and tipped into a copy of an indifferent 17th century travel book. I found a rather substantial list of books available at reasonable rates from Elizabeth Hutchinson of Durham. She was likely the wife of a bookbinder, Hugh Hutchinson, who kept shop. She kept shop from 1665 to 1684. Marjorie Yeo was a printer with her husband Philip. Their last imprint together was 1709. Her shop was located in the Cathedral Close at St. Martin's Lane in Exeter. Her own imprint from 1708 lasted through at least 1728. She was an enterprising stationer, selling painted papers for the hanging of rooms, writing paper, history books, maps, mathematical instruments of all kinds, sand, pens, sealing wax, papers, inks, scientific instruments. And she likewise binds all sorts of books, very reasonable. Theodora de Verdion, or Theodora Gran, was a German living in London. He became a figure of great curiosity and was a familiar eccentric on the streets of London. A language teacher, translator, itinerant bookseller, and dealer in metals, he assumed a male identity. She cross-dressed and earned her living as a translator and bookseller. This image is from 1793-94, and there is a trade card for Verdion in the collection of the British Museum, stating that he teaches German, French, and English in the most expeditious manner and on the most reasonable terms. I think this might be a moment to mention that I have never collected stereotypical images, either of women, African Americans, or any other person that might be depicted in a demeaning or negative way. I always felt that there were plenty of others who were comfortable doing this, but not me. On the left, on the top left, Jane Aiken, a bookbinder and printer. Her father was a printer, as was often the case. She inherited his debt, incurred not by his printing shop, but by her brother-in-law, a clockmaker. Jane Aiken was responsible not only for that debt, but for the support of her younger sisters after their mother died. Alas, she ended up in debtor's prison, the press equipment auctioned, though bought by a friend who saved it for her. Jane Aiken had her own imprint from 1802. She printed the first census in the United States to list persons of color, the Census Directory of 1811. And that is a term, persons of color, that we think of as contemporary, but here it was on the title page of the Philadelphia Census. Sorry. Sorry for the dog interruption. The census listed the names, addresses, and vocations of all the Black inhabitants of Philadelphia at that time. Jane Aiken appears to have done all the binding for her father's shop. She printed for the American Philosophical Society and the Philadelphia Athenaeum. She bound over 400 books for the Philosophical Society. She also bound and printed for the Presbyterian Society. It was a very busy shop, printing journals and selling books and stationery. She also printed the first Bible, printed by a woman in the United States, Thompson's Bible. Lydia Phillips on the lower left. Following the death of her husband, in order to earn a living, Lydia Phillips placed an advertisement in Paulson's American Daily Advertiser about continuing her business, the circulating library, as she has children to support. The subscriber, Lydia Phillips, having been suddenly deprived of an affectionate husband, now finds the maintenance of a helpless family of 6 small children dependent entirely on her exertions, which she earnestly solicits the aid of her friends and a liberal public to encourage by their patronage of the establishment of a circulating library, lately conducted by her husband, which she intends to continue at number 119 South 3rd Street, opposite the Mansion House Hotel, and to use her best exertions to render it deserving of the support which she thus, in behalf of herself and her children, most respectfully and with all the solicitude of an anxious mother, solicits. The following year, an advertisement states that Mrs. Phillips returns her sincere thanks to her friends and the public for their generous patronage and hopes to merit a continuance of their favor by procuring all the new works that can be obtained. She then goes on to mention some new books that have arrived, including a novel called Sense and Sensibility, which had just been published in London and was arriving by ship to American bookstores and circulating libraries. Phillips continues her circulating library through at least 1822. I'm very grateful to Jim Green, the librarian at the Library Company of Philadelphia, for identifying this ephemeral ticket. Anne Catherine Green, on the right, was born in Holland and worked alongside her husband in his Maryland printing business. When he died in 1767, she inherited his bankruptcy debt along with the shop. She successfully petitioned to continue her appointment as public printer to the province of Maryland. Sympathetic to the revolution, she ran a busy shop and a post office. She printed books, pamphlets, almanacs, and published the Maryland Gazette. She bore 14 children. 6 survived infancy. On the lower right are 2 examples of her colonial currency. Nature printing was used to prevent counterfeiting. As she ran her Albion Press, Elizabeth Delahoy also kept a boarding house. Delahoy was a printer, binder, and stationer in Greenwich, England. In 1808, a fire destroyed the shop that she owned with her husband, taking his life. She carried on their business at least through 1824, while simultaneously running the boarding house and raising children. She printed typographically complex books alongside bread and butter job printing, such as this broadside. Delahoy advertises the speed with which she can print notices regarding crime or loss at her press. This is a bookseller license that was issued to Therese Bedrin in the 19th century to continue to run their bookshop after her husband's death. Therese Bedrin had to establish her sound moral character and her support for the government in compliance with new and strict laws that were governing booksellers, instituted between 1810 and 1814. These laws were to combat unlicensed printing and the trade in prohibited books. This certificate authorized her to retail books, which she ceased to do in 14th of May, 1852, making way for another bookseller. A book, as Mindy Dubansky coined the term in her wonderful exhibition at the Grolier Club a few years ago, things in the shape of books, but not a book. This marvelous little die-cut book, about 3 to 4 inches across, is an invitation to a party given by the bindery girls. Bookbinding was one of the most important trades for women in the early 20th century, not only in New York, but in other cities such as Cleveland. This wonderful surviving piece of ephemera attests to its importance. The intention is clear: use this label, a union label. In 1913, the Russell Sage Foundation published its first study of the conditions of women's work, Mary Van Vliet's Women in the Bookbinding Trades. My copy is at Duke, at the Rubenstein Library. This is a melange of bookseller's tickets, circulating library tickets, a binder's ticket, a billhead, all ephemera from a variety of book-related trades, both English and American. Book tickets are those tiny bits of printed paper that were often pasted on the front paste down of a book. They are only about 1 inch or 2 in length. Anne Knight of Nottingham in the center is about 1 1/4 inch. Miss Seavey's circulating library to its left is about 3 inches. Now to leave books. Sarah Clarkson was located in Tamworth, and this card dates from 1831, a market town in the West Midlands. It's approximately 3 inches, and it proclaims that she and her son John will carry on as usual with strict attention, punctuality, and moderate charges. They are reassuring their customers, as well as flogging a new system of hot air heat. On the right, Mrs. W. Gorman, a chimney sweep, about 4 inches, quite large. These 2 women were working in trades or running businesses that were not traditional roles for women, and protecting against unprincipled persons trading on their name. On the right is Sarah Biffen, the great late Ricky Jay, in fact, owned the drawing for this depiction of Sarah Biffen. When I walked into his house, I was just stunned to see it there on the bookcase. Sarah Biffen was born in Somerset without arms or legs. She earned a living as a sideshow attraction. She was a highly skilled miniature painter, accomplishing both miniature painting and calligraphy remarkably with her mouth. She was exhibited at the St. Bartholomew's Fair in 1808. A number of her paintings were accepted for exhibition by the Royal Academy. Ultimately, she was granted a pension by Queen Victoria. Two of her miniature paintings are in the collection at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Sarah Biffen died at age 66. Martha Ann Honeywell was one of dozens of atypically figured itinerant artists and performers in the early 19th century. She was born with truncated arms and legs, no hands, and only one small foot with 3 toes. She learned to make paper cutouts and silhouettes, to embroider, and to create waxwork miniatures. Honeywell was a savvy businesswoman who for most of her career traveled alone on national and international tours, earning her own living. She exhibited her works in a traveling pavilion at parades and fairs. This is a page of lithographically printed cards, porcelain, known as porcelain trade cards. They were sometimes had additional hand coloring, and they were often printed with gold or metallic ink. They were printed, for the most part, in Belgium and Antwerp or Ghent. The cards were printed on heavy stock, were coated with a lead surface, and calendared to be made smooth and glossy, and then pressed through rollers, thus the name porcelain cards. On the upper left, Madame Toby, a trade card for ladies of the night, though other examples are less surprising. They're for bonnet sellers and corset makers and a bakery. The trade card in the upper left is a new acquisition. It came from E.V. Eisenberg. So I'm delighted with that acquisition. These are 4 general English trade cards. Mrs. Hill was a furrier in Exeter. She cleaned furs, dressed them, repaired, and altered to the newest fashion. I love that melange of animals in the center, quite a little gathering. Mrs. Allen was a milliner in Chester on the left. And 2 women who ran hotels, Mary Surflin, who had a coffee room enlarging in Kent, and Mrs. Helens, a hotelier in Bristol. Margaret Graham was a balloonist. She took off from Cranmore Gardens in 1849 in London. She was a very fine publicist. She wrote of her ascents in the press and was often accompanied by her 4 daughters. She was, in 1846, the first British woman to make a solo balloon flight. In 1850, she suffered a fire during a descent. She was not injured and lived into her 70s, dying in her own bed. Emily Vandermeersch was a naturalist, a bird whisperer. She performed and charged, of course, admission with her birds to support herself. Mary Scarlett, a Quaker and anti-slavery activist, graduated from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in 1857. She became professor of anatomy at the college in 1862. Her childhood home was the center of anti-slavery activity in Robeson Township in Berks County, Pennsylvania. She practiced amongst the poor and gave lectures on hygiene and health in rural communities. Hospitals at this time were not open to women for purposes of instruction. In response, the Women's Medical College opened the Women's Hospital in Philadelphia in 1861. Scarlett served as resident physician at the hospital for 10 years until glaucoma and loss of vision forced her to retire. Madame Nora and Madame Reith, these are 1870s, 1880s, both women had troops of itinerant glass blowers. They demonstrated the magic of glass blowing, the spinning and making of fantastical objects as entertainment. Their shows were well advertised. The Corning Museum has a wonderful poster of Madame Nora. It still eludes me. It is a poster with a likeness of Madame Nora and promises that every visitor gets a present. Someday I'll find one. A consistent promise and enticement to attend her shows. The earliest known traveling woman glassblower was a Mrs. Johnson in the mid-18th century. She traveled to Dublin and to Edinburgh. This is the top of a little bit of stationary ephemeral bit of writing paper depicting women fish peddlers, which I of course found irresistible. And those are the costumes that were worn by fish peddlers, very colorful striped costumes. Anne Gallagher ran an oyster house in New York City. She also had a stand in Washington Market, likely in the 1890s. Ellen Louise Demarest was born in 1824. Her father owned a millinery factory in Schuylerville, New York. She was an abolitionist and employed both Black and white women, and she paid them equally. Demarest was considered to have invented tissue patterns for dressmaking. She had seen a Black employee making a pattern for clothing and adopted that idea. I wondered always, did her employee benefit from those sales of over 8 million patterns? It was, however, Butterick who ultimately patented the process, though it was Ellen Demarest who made the first commercial patterns that were printed and produced in the United States. She also published a journal, Demarest's Monthly Magazine, and Madame Demarest's Mirror of Fashions. In 1876, there were 3 million patterns distributed through 1,500 agencies. She encouraged women to be enterprising in new fields, such as telegraphy, typesetting, and bookkeeping, though we know that typesetting was not a new field. In 1868, she was one of the founders of the Cirrhosis Club for Working Women. Thousands of women set up shop as photographers before 1900. We're only looking at a few examples here, and of course only as examples of photographic ephemera. But women not only worked as photographers, they also earned a living as colorists, retouchers, and photographic printers. Lydia Webb White on the upper left is a daguerreotype card. She was the city's first and only woman daguerreotypist. Her card states all types of cases constantly on hand, sold less than half charged at other places. This establishment has the best arranged light in the state, up 1 flight of stairs only. Lydia White owned and operated her own studio in 1854. A year later, her husband Joseph joined the firm of L.B. White and Company. Joseph White had given up engineering to learn photography and had spent a year in partnership with George Walker, another Providence daguerreotypist. Nothing else is known about Lydia White. These small ephemeral cards were often glued to the back of the daguerreotype case. The Julia Driver collection of women in photography at Yale has a full plate daguerreotype attributed to Mrs. White with the same card on the back. Margaret McFarlane on the lower left, there is, yes, an amber type on the reverse, and she is recorded in the Boston City Directory from 1858 to 1860, and she made photographs of sick and deceased persons, those extraordinary photographs of mortuary, yes. On the right, Mrs. Young of Fayetteville, Arkansas. She advertised her business in this visually compelling way. She was financially successful, enough to have caused to be built the Mrs. Young building in the Italianate style in 1887. It's one of the older buildings on the square in Fayetteville, Arkansas. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. Young migrated from Illinois to Arkansas. She built her own 2-story studio in 1887. And her studio was on the 2nd floor and she rented out the 1st floor. Ultimately, she retired, living on the income from the business and the rent. The Young Block is a handsome and quite substantial building still standing in Fayetteville. Tennessee Claflin, on the left, was a stockbroker born in Ohio. She was the first woman that we know of to open a brokerage firm. It opened in partnership with her sister, Victoria Woodhull, and the backing of Tenny's lover, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Tenny and Victoria Claflin were children of a ne'er-do-well. Their father was a spiritualist and healer, engaging in quackery. At their brokerage firm, the sisters were successful in attracting women investors. It was clearly an underserved and wide open market. Their customers were small business owners, society women, school teachers, and widows, etc. Woodhull and Claflin began publishing their weekly, which espoused free love and supported women's agency over their own bodies and the right to make one's own decision about sex. All of this followed the success of their brokerage house. Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly was the first paper in America to print the Communist Manifesto. The brokerage firm went under in 1873 during an economic depression. On the right, Mademoiselle Angela, who was an aerialist, worked for P.T. Barnum. She was known as the female Samson. This is a miscellaneous gathering of trade cards simply to show the variety of businesses and professions that women were engaged in. There's a hat and wig maker, coral shells and curiosities, fancy goods, in New Bedford, fine embroidery in Syracuse, New York. On the left, the woman, this is colliery women. On the left is a woman who was known as a pit brow lass. She was a surface laborer from Wigan near Manchester. Her task was to pick stones from the coal after it was hauled to the surface, working at the brow of the pit. Children, both boys and girls as young as 7, worked in the coal pits alongside their fathers. In 1842, the Mines and Collieries Act was passed, forbidding women, including girls and boys under 10, from working underground in the pits. Women had worked 11 or 12-hour days and were, of course, paid wages half that of the men. Some women were desperate for the work and dressed as men so they could still be employed in the pits. The brow women wore clogs, trousers, and aprons, or skirts over trousers, and a head covering to keep their hair free of coal dust. It was a dangerous and not pleasant work. This is a studio photograph sold for tourist consumption. Layers out of the dead, women were traditionally responsible in their communities for assuming the role of layers out of the dead. They prepared and washed the body of the deceased, often laying them out on the dining room table. At some point, they decided to charge for this important service. It became a means of earning a living. These trade cards of Lily Geiger and Mrs. Barton, whose first name we don't know, are both from Pennsylvania. Cecilia Bow was the first woman teacher at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, the very school that Thomas Eakins had been fired from for teaching female students life drawing from a male model. It's a card from an exhibition she had at St. Botolph Club. In 1903, Kate Cranston opened her tea rooms on Soccer Hall Street in Glasgow. They were designed by Jessie M. King. The rooms, in fact, were designed by contemporaries of Jessie M. King at the Glasgow School of Art, Sisters Frances and Margaret MacDonald, and Margaret's husband, the architect Charles Rennie Mackintosh. These 2 ephemeral advertisement cards made in 1903 were commissioned by Kate Cranston a consummate businesswoman, who was notable for her organizational and management skills and as a restaurateur. These, however, were temperance tea rooms, no booze. It was Kate Cranston who commissioned McIntosh to design the Willow tea rooms. Jessie M. King taught book design at the Glasgow School of Art. She designed jewelry for Liberties, decorated ceramics, made batik fabric, and illustrated quite a number of books. Artists Annie MacDonald, Anne French, and Catherine Cameron were her peers at the Glasgow School of Art. She was a member of the Glasgow Society of Lady Artists, and after marriage, she kept her own name. Many innovative and original designers such as Margaret Armstrong, Blanche McManus, Sarah Wyman Whitman, Alice Morse, and Amy Sacklip, along with Jessie M. King, are responsible for designing numbers of quote unquote publishers' bindings. Jessie M. King believed in fairies. I will leave it at that. Ellen Armstrong was the first Black woman magician that we know of. I often say that we know of because things can, of course, appear. A mind reader and illusionist, she had been performing with her father, John Hartford Armstrong, since her early childhood, beginning at the age of 6. The Armstrongs traveled either by train or in their own car with a driver, often sleeping in their rail car, so not to be denied a place to sleep because of Jim Crow laws and segregation. The Armstrongs performed only in front of Black audiences at many churches and schools, such as the Hampton Institute. Her father died suddenly in 1939 when Helen Armstrong was 25. She took over his show, becoming the first African-American female magician that we know of. She continued touring with her own show, performing exclusively for Black audiences, traveling mainly on the East Coast from Boston to Florida for 31 years. She continued to stay with families or slept on trains. She drew as part of her show, adding Black content and incorporating contemporary Black heroes such as Joe Louis. Joe Louis, who replaced Frederick Douglass, who figured in her father's repertory. She ultimately married and in a number of years retired to South Carolina, where in 1979 she died. On the left, sorting rags for paper making. Women have been employed in paper mills as unskilled laborers for hundreds of years. There exist 17th century engravings of women doing just this, sorting rags and justifying and carrying paper, as depicted in the Lawns engravings of 1698. On the right, sewing in a sweatshop, African-American woman on the front left, and this harkens back 100 years earlier when Madame de Maurès learned to draw patterns from her Black employee. An exhibition in Manchester showing the work women were engaged in during World War I. Munitions work was the largest single employer of women during 1918. Women were recruited to work in munitions factories. African-Americans were discriminated against in the aircraft industry. There were no Black workers at Boeing in Seattle. The union, the International Association of Machinists, was segregated. Seattle, however, had an increasingly large and growing Black population, and pressure was on. Blacks were ultimately allowed to join the union, and in 1942, Flossie Spearman and Dorothy West Williams became the first African Americans to be hired at Boeing. Alas, I don't know the names of these two individuals who are machinists working in the cockpit of a plane. I hope that I've demonstrated in a small way the breadth and variety of ways that women have earned a living. The evidence is there, but as we have learned, ephemera is part of the complex puzzle that history has left us to tell a more complete story. This is a photograph taken by Annie Schlechter, the books in situ before they moved to Duke University. The books were all double shelved. On the table, you see a Bronte needlework, anonymous African-American woman printed on tin, and a variety of metals and objects. And with gratitude, because I could not have done it without the following.
Lisa, thank you, thank you, thank you for a phenomenal presentation. I am so sorry we had that little glitch, but you more than compensated for our technical difficulties by bringing us just a fantastic presentation. I have so many notes here that I don't even know where to begin. Just the wide-ranging occupations that you showed women involved in. I mean, the last one that I made a note of was Ellen Armstrong. You know, what a great piece of advertising for her. If laughing hurts you, stay home.
Right.
You know, don't come here.
Right.
We don't want you here. And then one wonders if she actually started in 1889, because if it had been 1888, going fine since 1888 wouldn't rhyme with 1889. But
that was her father.
That was her father. That's correct. That's correct. I remember there was a restaurant bar in South Carolina where we vacationed, and it was owned by a fellow named Jerome, and his calling card said, "Bring it on home, bring it to Jerome. You know, come to Jerome's place." Pardon me. And just all of these, the wide-ranging aspect of this was just incredible. One question that was asked about Jane Aitken and about her bindings, and the question was, do you know, does the American Philosophical Society, do they have a listing of her bindings? To your knowledge?
I don't believe so. I don't know, but I would assume they don't have a list of her bindings. And
Yeah.
Of course, she printed as well as bound. And while her father was alive, she did do hundreds and hundreds of bindings. And I think they just have to be identified stylistically.
Yeah.
My copy that is now at Duke of the Jane Aitken Bible in 2 volumes was likely bound by her. The binding is absolutely of that moment and likely was her work.
I wonder too if there have been any modifications to her original bindings at APS, but you probably wouldn't be privy to that.
No. Sorry, I don't know.
Yeah, well, you can't know everything, Lisa, but you sure know an awful lot. Here's another question. The questioner says that I saw images in your presentation dating to World War II. Do you have a cutoff date for your collection?
So the cutoff date changes. It's pretty fluid. If I had stuck to my cutoff date, which was originally the Spanish Civil War, I would never have acquired the poster of Ellen Armstrong. So, and it was interesting because I had written to Ricky Jay about that poster, and it went beyond his date. And he sadly, as he remarked in our correspondence, didn't acquire that poster. And I did. So I'm really pleased that I have it. Yeah.
Well, that's good. Another question referred to, I think it was Vandermeersch, the bird whisperer.
Yeah.
What exactly is a bird whisperer?
I think she had developed a relationship with her birds. They came to her and responded to her, and nothing more than what is really described on that large broadsheet. But she earned her keep with her birds.
Well, yeah, that was a new one for me as well, as was Miss Honeywell, who had no limbs and had this extraordinary life.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
You know, for
Both-
her to travel as she did and to do what she did.
Well, she was also exhibited
Yeah,
as, as a wonder. She was, yeah.
yeah. Another question relates to the porcelain trade cards.
Yes.
This questioner asks, a porcelain trade card is something new. You did explain how the cards were manufactured,
Yes.
and they were from, I think they were from Ghent. But can you tell us anything additional about porcelain trade cards?
If you hold one in your hand, and if you see one, you'll see that there's a very shiny surface to the card, to the top of the card. The reverse of the card is dull and not shiny. And all I know from my research and collecting them, I have in fact hundreds of porcelain trade cards. But the process was that a lead emulsion was put on the surface, and then they were colandered, which is great pressure was put on the cards as they were being printed. And I don't know, further than that. Sure, there are some people who would know more of the process, and
Yeah, yeah. Well,
refer to them.
yeah. The process of creating them certainly explains the provenance of porcelain trade card.
Yeah, it was simply that the polish of the surface of the card resembled porcelain.
Yeah, and how interesting that they would be done in Ghent, for obvious reasons. A layer out of the dead. That is another response here that from one of our participants. That was a new profession for this person.
Well, it wasn't, it was always a traditional role for women to prepare bodies for a funeral, for death. And it was interesting to me that at some point, so in fact, in the Philadelphia census that was printed by Jane Aiken, there is a section, the entire back section of that book lists all of the vocations of people in Philadelphia at that time. It lists Mr. Peel's museum, it lists all the clubs, it lists the churches, the African AME church, but it also lists a group of layers out of the dead who were all women. At some point, what's intriguing to me, at some point, women decided to charge for that service that was expected of them. So,
That is intriguing, and they should have charged for that service.
of course.
By all means, absolutely. And one final question refers to the Cranston tea rooms and the association with Rennie McIntosh.
Yes.
I confess, when I looked at that, when I first looked at that, I thought, boy, that looks a lot like Rennie McIntosh here. But, and then you confirmed that. But can you tell us more about that association? It seems as though it was quite productive.
They were contemporaries, Jesse M. King and Charles Rennie McIntosh. McIntosh's wife, Margaret MacDonald, and his wife's sister, Frances MacDonald, were both artists, and they were responsible for a great deal of the interior decor of the tea rooms, of the Willow tea rooms, and of McIntosh's work as well. So yeah, they were an extraordinary, to think of that constellation all being together at the Glasgow, at the horribly sad Glasgow School of Art. It has had 2 fires.
Yeah.
That's 10 years. It's been horrific.
Well, we've sadly run out of time for, but I do want to quote one of our participants today, using a single word, brava.
Thank you.
And it was a bravura presentation. And you have illustrated, if there's ever any doubt in anyone's mind, what is the value of ephemera? You have answered that question for all time. Thank you so much. And we now go back to our president, Richard Schief.
Well, Lisa, thank you so very much for sharing some of your insights into this vast and important subject. It is very much appreciated. And of course, for such spectacular and rare ephemera, which we love to see. We're going to jump ahead for the moment to our next speaker, our second scheduled speaker today, Caroline Preston, whose two innovative scrapbook novels were created largely from her own extensive collections of ephemera. She'll be exploring Sylvia Beach, founder of the legendary Paris bookstore Shakespeare and Company, back in those exciting days of the 1920s and the 1930s. Caroline, the spotlight is now yours.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dick. All right, let's see. Oh, well, oh, wait a second. Sorry. Oh, wait. I need to, I'm not on speak. Okay, Dick, can you make my screen come up? Okay.
Your screen is up, we see you.
Okay, all right, let me
You just need to share screen at the bottom.
Oh, yeah, okay, all right. I'm going to do share screen. Here we go. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Okay. All right. Anyway, I do want to thank Dick Schief and Barbara Lowe and everyone for inviting me to speak at this conference.
Carol, we cannot see your screen, just so you know.
Okay, I'm sorry. Well, thank you for telling me that. We all seem to be plagued by mishaps today. All right, let me go back. All right, well, for some reason, it's because you are coming up as the speaker, not me. Why is that?
No, just at the bottom of the screen, hit.
Yeah, but
it says share screen.
I did, okay, share, okay, yep.
Okay.
Okay, all right, now, is that it? Now you're getting it now?
Yep, just make it so that's in
Yeah, I will, okay, all right. Now we're now we're going. Wonderful. Well, I want to thank Dick and Barbara for inviting me to the Ephemera Society. I had the pleasure of speaking here once before, a few years ago, and I bought these wonderful posters that are behind me. And it is my great pleasure to talk about one of my very favorite subjects, Sylvia Beach. Sylvia Beach is today considered one of the great literary icons and feminist icons of the 20th century. She is famous for being the first publisher, the only woman who dared to publish Ulysses when all other publishers in the United States and England refused to do it. She also ran a bookstore an English bookstore in Paris, which was the center for all expatriate writers at that time. And she was a radical feminist who rejected gender norms and lived her entire life with a woman. But Sylvia Beach did not start out as a radical in any way. She was the daughter of a Presbyterian minister, and she grew up in Princeton, New Jersey. Her whole life, she was plagued by terrible chronic headaches. And as a result, she never really had a traditional education. She did not go to school and also had to live almost a life of a recluse. So in order to really understand her life and how it differed from so many others or other women, I think I want to start with her living in Italy in 1909. And one of the women that she lived with was Marion Mason, who was my grandmother. Sylvia's there to study language, and my grandmother was there to study opera, and they became very good friends in that year. But I think at this point their lives changed. Their lives diverted, and my grandmother's life definitely went towards more traditional paths, and Sylvia's did not. My grandmother tried to make it as an opera singer, and she realized that she could not, and she also didn't want to have a life as a professional woman. So she returned to her family in Highland Park, Illinois. Sylvia, meanwhile, knew that she would not marry and she would not go to have a traditional life. And I think we can see what happened next. During World War I, Sylvia worked on a farm as a farm volunteer during the war in France. And then she also volunteered as in the Red Cross working in Serbia. My grandmother, on the other hand, got married to a lawyer in Highland Park, and she had her first child. She named Sylvia, and Sylvia Beach was the goddaughter of the godmother of her child, and that child, Sylvia Peter Preston, is my mother. Sylvia and Marion were friends their entire lives, and they were very ardent correspondents. And so many of the records that I'm going to show you are from her collection of letters, and most of those letters are at the Princeton Library with all the other holdings of Sylvia Beach. I have some of them, but most of the images that you're going to see are from the Princeton Library, which has very generously let me use them. In 1918, the war was over, and Sylvia Beach decided to return to go to Paris, where she had always wanted to live. And she joined a great crowd of people coming to Paris at that time. There were expatriate writers coming from Europe, coming from the United States and England to settle in Paris. They came for several reasons. One, it was very inexpensive to the dollar with the franc was very advantageous for Americans, very cheap to live there, but also they were searching for personal freedoms. The United States had prohibition, and they could lead more sexually free lives and unrestrained and nonconformist lives than they ever could in the United States. Now, in 1917, Sylvia Beach made a very important friendship, and that is with a woman named Adrienne Monnier, who ran a French bookstore on the Rue de l'Odéon. And her bookstore was a center for women, for French writers of all varieties. And she and Sylvia Beach formed a very close friendship, which eventually became a romantic partnership, and they lived together for 30 years. Adrienne Monnier encouraged Sylvia Beach to open an English language bookstore in Paris, which was definitely needed. And so with her encouragement, in 1919, she opened a bookstore. It was on a side street, Rue Duc Toyen, and it was on a side street from the Rue de l'Odéon. And it had been a former laundry, and she rented it. And in 1919, she opened her bookstore. This is what we're seeing here on the right is a flyer that she sent out trying to get subscribers. So it carried not only English books, but it also carried a very large selection of all the little reviews, the literary reviews that were coming out at that time, which were numerous, such as The Dial and The Little Review and Broom. So Sylvia furnished her store. She went to all the flea markets and got used English books. She got used furniture, but she wanted to make her space very comfortable and homey looking. And so she covered the walls with burlap and put Serbian rugs on the floor to kind of give it a cozy look. So right away, her first members were Gertrude Stein, and who lived with Alice B. Toklas in the neighborhood, and Ezra Pound. And these are some wonderful portraits by Man Ray. Man Ray and Bernice Abbott were photographers who lived in Paris at that time and made some famous portraits of all the literary folk. But Sylvia Beach's most famous and devoted member was Ernest Hemingway, who moved to Paris in 1921. And so this is a picture of them outside of the bookstore. And on the right, you have his library card. And it's a wonderful record of all the books that he read in those 10 years. And he would basically check out a big pile of books every 2 weeks. So I think one of the best descriptions that we have of Sylvia Beach at that time is by Ernest Hemingway in his book, A Movable Feast. On a cold, windswept street, there was the Shakespeare and Company was a lovely, cheerful place with a big stove in winters, tables and shelves of books, new books in the window, and photographs on the wall of famous writers, both living and dead. Sylvia had a lively, very sharply cut face, brown eyes that were as live as small animals, and gay as a young girl, and wavy brown hair that was brushed back from her fine forehead and cut below her ears, and at the line of the collar of the brown jacket she wore. She had pretty legs and was kind and cheerful and interested and loved to make jokes and gossip, and no one that I ever knew was nicer to me. And this was pretty much what all writers at that time said. She was incredibly generous. She let people use her place as a bank drop, as a mail drop. She lent them money when they needed it. And she always provided a generous ear to their complaints. And she also served as a social secretary. She invited or introduced writers to other writers, and also introduced them to French writers. And some of her famous early members were William Carlos Williams, Archibald MacLeish, Sinclair Lewis, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Catherine Ann Porter, D.H. Lawrence, T.S. Eliot, and John Dos Passos. So in 1920, a very important thing happened. James Joyce moved to Paris. He had been in self-exile from Ireland since 1904. And he had been living this peripatetic life in Zurich and in Trieste. He'd mostly lived in Trieste, where he taught English at a Berlitz school for very little money. And in that time, he wrote Dubliners and Portrait of an Artist as a young man, which he had trouble, which were considered vulgar and somewhat obscene, and he had trouble getting them published, but he did finally manage to get them published in England and in the United States. And then he was working on his great masterpiece, Ulysses, and he was succeeding at getting it published in little magazines, but it was a difficult time trying to find an English or an American publisher. So at Ezra Pound's encouragement, he moved with his family to Paris to kind of step out into the real world, to get more exposure and hopefully make more connections and money. He moved with his wife, Nora, and their 2 adult children, Giorgio and Lucia. At that time, Joyce was 38 years old, and he had many problems. So one thing was his failing eyesight. He was struggling with glaucoma, and he was slowly going blind. So anyway, Sylvia greatly admired Joyce, and she just grabs in her memoirs her first meeting with him at a party at Albert Spire's house. There, drooping in a corner between 2 bookcases, was James Joyce. Trembling, I asked, "Is this the great James Joyce?" And we shook hands. That is, he put his limp, boneless hand in my little tough paw, if you can call that a handshake. Oh, wait a second. So Joyce at that time, as I said before, he was getting his Ulysses was being serialized in a magazine called The Little Review. And he describes himself as making no compromise with the public taste. It was run by 2 women, Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap, in New York. And at that time, and during 1819, 1920, they were publishing the first chapters of Ulysses, and they were being confiscated as being obscene. So in 1920, they were brought up on an obscenity trial, and by something called the Society for the Suppression of Vice, which was an organization that worked in New York or in the United States trying to get works declared obscene. And they lost that case. And all the issues of the little review were confiscated and burned. And at that point, and also some of Joyce's work, because it had not been published in English, was being pirated by people. So at that point, every American publisher and every English publisher then said that they could not publish Ulysses because it would be declared obscene. They would be fined, they could be put in jail, and all their books would be burned. So at this point, Joyce was in despair. And he came to Sylvia Beach, and and at this point, he was great friends with her. He'd visit her at her bookstore, and he would commiserate. And I love these pictures of Joyce because they really look and she describes how he looked. He was always dressed in a shabby suit and his little fedora. And he always carried an ash plant walking cane, ash plant from Dublin. I think he also carried it because he was partially blind. And then he always wore dirty tennis shoes. So Sylvia, he commiserated with her, and Sylvia Beach said to him, "Would you let me publish Ulysses?" Which was an incredible, and he accepted because he had no other options. But it was an insane offer for her to make. She had no experience publishing. She had no money to support that. And she also was in ill health. And so all the kind of editing work and thing were migraines were going to be very difficult. But she wrote this letter to my grandmother in 1921 and explaining her decision to publish Ulysses. "My shop is a great success. Just think, I am publishing a book now, Ulysses by James Joyce, the greatest book and author of the age. Ulysses is a masterpiece, and one day it will be ranked among the classics of English literature. Joyce is in Paris, and I told him I would publish his book, and after the publisher in New York threw up their hands in fright." So it's interesting her impressions at that time, because she considered Ulysses, which only existed, it wasn't even completed, it just existed in a few chapters, was going to be the masterpiece of modern American literature. That was not a universal opinion. George Bernard Shaw said it was disgusting. Virginia Woolf said it was like a teenager picking at his pimples. So anyway, in 1921, they put out this prospectus saying that they were going to publish Ulysses, and they got some publicity photographs there. And so this is the form that they passed out. They were going to publish 1,000 copies of Ulysses. 100 would be fancy, 150 would be less fancy, and the rest would be common paper. And they put out all these subscription forms, and they went all over the world. But they were sold all over Paris and in the United States and in England. And she pretty much managed to sell out the subscription. But then the next challenge was, how was she going to put it together? At that point, Joyce had not finished it. He had not written the end chapters, including the very famous Penelope chapter, which is Molly Bloom's soliloquy. So for the first thing she had to find a printer. And she used a French printer, Darantière, who was in Dijon. And it was probably to her advantage that she used a French printer, because he didn't speak English, and he didn't understand what Joyce was writing, which was good. But then they had to get it typed, and they went through dozens of typists, American typists, because they would type a little bit and then they would be so shocked and appalled they would quit. The other challenge is that Joyce insisted on completely revising the the text again and again. And so this is a typical page with his corrections, which Sylvia Beach said it was covered with Joyce's rockets and stars. And what he would do is then he would put the corrections, and then they would reset the type, and then he would correct it again. So this was costing Sylvia Beach, who's already working on a shoestring, and it cost Sylvia Beach a tremendous amount more money to do this. But she really believed in James Joyce, and she did not want to curtail him in any way. I mean, one of the other problems is that the text was filled with typos, hundreds and hundreds of typos. And the Joyce industry in the last 50 years has spent all their time sorting through the typos, wondering if it was really a typo or was it one of the kind of pieces of wordplay that Joyce did. So in 1922, on Joyce's birthday, February 2nd, 40th birthday, the first copy of Ulysses came out, and it was in paperback, and it was covered with a blue kind of lithograph paper that they worked very hard because they wanted to achieve the perfect blue color of the Greek flag in honor of Ulysses. This is a picture of the interior pages. So the next challenge was, how were they going to get it distributed? And so Sylvia called, especially in the United States, where they could be seized and they couldn't just send them through the mail. So she called on many of her friends, and one of the friends she called on was my grandmother, who at this point was the wife of a very prosperous, proper lawyer in Highland Park, Illinois. And she sent her most valuable copies, the most expensive ones, to my grandmother to repackage, to send them to New York, where they could possibly get confiscated. Now, this is a picture taken of Sylvia Beach and my grandmother and my mother and her sister in Sylvia Beach's bookstore. And this was taken in 1924. And there's my mother kind of in the middle. And so this is a picture of Sylvia Beach and James Joyce taken in 1925. And with the publication of Ulysses, they both really became celebrities. Joyce was considered the greatest author of the modernist era, and writers and fans flocked to Paris to meet him. And he was very shy and kind of avoided people, but people would follow him on the street and, peer in through the windows just to get a glimpse of him. And Sylvia Beach herself and her bookstore became very famous. And in fact, hotels would guide people to her store, and tour buses would rattle down her street and point out her store. Also, they were becoming famous internationally. And these are a series of just articles that appeared about both of them. So Sylvia Beach had come a long, long way from her when she started 6 years ago in a little store. Actually, by this time, so the Shakespeare and Company also moved to the Rue de l'Odéon to a bigger premises. So so tourists flocked to Sylvia Beach to get Ulysses because it was kind of the great daring thing to bring back from Paris. And Sylvia Beach ran ads in the newspaper, trying to attract people to come to pick up their copy of Ulysses, and they constantly were selling out. And so this is a sign that was in the front window of Shakespeare and Company telling them that all their copies were exhausted. So Sylvia Beach made 12 additional printings of Ulysses. And overall, this was over a period of about till the late 20s. And overall, she probably sold about 40,000 copies. But her relationship with James Joyce became increasingly difficult. At this point, James Joyce had become basically a worldwide celebrity, and he liked it that way. And he also was a bourgeois, and he liked the comfortable lifestyle. of living in nice apartments with his family, and um, he felt he was owed this. And here he is, where we see him, um, with his luxurious velvet jacket, and and when he traveled, he insisted on traveling first class and staying in nice hotels. And he also, with his family, here he is, they would eat out every single night in a fancy restaurant in Paris. And he expected um, Sylvia Beach to basically, pay him. He just felt he had no sense of money, and he just felt like surely she had made a fortune on Shakespeare, on publishing Ulysses. And he would go to her bookstore, or his son would go to her bookstore and just simply clean out her cash box whenever they were a little short of funds. He also used her as his servant. She was expected to handle his correspondence and to run errands for him, and also she was his bank. And anytime, as I said, anytime he needed money, she would come. They just go and help themselves. And so very much she was on the verge of working herself to death and going bankrupt. I also want to mention at this point, as we see Joyce here reading with a magnifying glass, his vision during these 10 years in Paris, for the 20 years in Paris, his eyesight was continuing to deteriorate rapidly. And he had a series of 12 eye operations to try and prevent the progressive effects of glaucoma. But unfortunately, they do not have the eye drops and the antibiotics, nor the sophisticated surgery that they now have available, and the descriptions of his eye surgeries are just absolutely harrowing. But more and more, he was really reliant on people to help him with his correspondence and with his writing. And there were many people that were willing to work with him and help him, including Samuel Beckett and Paul Léon and Jolas. And so and the other thing is that all during this time, starting in about 1923, he was working on his magnum opus, or what he considered his magnum opus, which was Finnegan's Wake, but it was taking him years and years to do it. So his relationship with Sylvia Beach was becoming more and more strained, more and more difficult. And in 1933, an important thing happened, which was Ulysses was put on trial for obscenity by the Society for the Suppression of Vice in New York. They brought the case with a seized copy of Shakespeare and Company's edition, and it went to court, and it was deemed by a man named Judge Woolsey as not to be obscene. It was a work of art. And this was a momentous decision and a real turning point for Joyce, because at that point it meant that he could obtain a real American publisher and a real English publisher. And he was approached by many publishers, and finally he was published by Random House. So they paid him $45,000, which in that time was a great deal of money. And he felt he owed Sylvia Beach nothing. And he simply sold the money, and that she didn't own the rights, and he simply took it away from her and sold it to Random House. And so she had basically spent 10 years as his slave getting this book out, and she was never compensated for it. So at this point, their relationship became extremely bitter and estranged in the 1930s. So Sylvia Beach continued her bookstore through the 30s, but Paris had changed drastically. Because of the Depression, many of the expat writers just simply could no longer afford to live there anymore, and they just simply headed home to get jobs. And also, tourists that used to flock to her store were no longer coming. So she really was on the brink of bankruptcy, and her situation was really quite dire. And so in the late 30s, a group of French writers and Anne Hemingway banded together to give a series of readings in her store, and they started a sort of charity for her to give her money. And then also, Sylvia Beach had many people that helped her, including my grandmothers, with small sums of money. But she was really helped by a woman named Breyer, who is a writer and at that time, and I mean a writer and a figure in literary society at that time. And she really helped her out by giving her a regular stipend. So in the late 30s, more and more Sylvia Beach relied on young American girls who wanted to come over and work in the store and help her out. And one of those women who helped her out was my mother, Sylvia Peter Preston, or Sylvia Peter at that time. And she was 19 years old, and she came to the Shakespeare and Company. And this is, I love this postcard. This is a postcard that the two Sylvias wrote together to my grandmother. And this is the top one is, I started today. So at Shakespeare and Company, and that's my mother's handwriting. And then that's Sylvia Beach signing at the bottom saying, Sylvia is so pretty, and I'm sure she will attract many people to come shop in our store. So again, things started really looking very dire in Paris at the late 30s, because certainly war was coming. And although people didn't really know how much it would affect France, they could see the handwriting on the wall. So in 1939, Joyce published his great opus, Finnegan's Wake, which of course turned out not to be a great opus. I mean, it was very obscure, very difficult, and people really felt that Ulysses was by far his masterpiece. So, but he was publishing it, and the photographer Giselle Freund, who photographed a lot of literary figures in the late 30s, arranged to have this photo shoot at Shakespeare and Company. And this was the first time that Adrienne Monnier and Sylvia Beach and James Joyce had been together in a long time. And so they spent the afternoon here reminiscing about old times and sort of having a very nostalgic reunion, but it was melancholy. I think everyone could see that it was changing. And Joyce had a lot of problems of his own, along with his failing eyesight. His daughter Lucia was a schizophrenic, and her behavior was really out of control, and he's very, very worried about her. So this is a picture of their final meeting. In 1940, the Nazis came into occupied Paris. And at this point, most Americans had left. And Sylvia Beach was very, very much encouraged by her family and by the American embassy to leave, because really no one knew what was going to happen. But she kind of went back and forth. And finally, she decided her home was in Paris, with Shakespeare and Company and Adrienne Monnier, and she was going to stick it out. And on the right is a snapshot that she took from the Rue de l'Odéon of German tanks rumbling down the street. Meanwhile, in 1940, Joyce moved with his family to Zurich. And in 1941, early 1941, Joyce, who had been in very declining health, died at the age of 58 of a perforated ulcer. So Sylvia Beach kept her bookstore running during the war, but things did not go according to plan. In 1942, a German officer a high-level German officer came to her bookstore, and he saw Finnegan's Wake in the window, and he wanted to buy it. And Sylvia Beach wouldn't sell it to him. She said, "This is my personal copy from Joyce. It's the only one I have. I won't sell it to you." And he became furious, and he said, "Then we will come back, and we will come back tomorrow, and we will confiscate all your books." So Sylvia Beach went up and down the Rue de l'Odéon, and she gathered all of her friends and her neighbors and asked them to help her. And her concierge offered the top floor apartment in her building which was empty. And with all of her neighbors, they put the books in baskets, and all of her papers, which was thousands of books and hundreds of pounds of papers, and pictures, and they carried them up the stairs to the 4th floor where they put them in hiding. And then Sylvia Beach hired carpenters to come and dismantle the bookcases, and a painter to come and paint the walls and the sign. And they took the sign down. And within a single afternoon, Shakespeare and Company disappeared, and it would never open again. So Sylvia Beach would continue to live in the apartment, but her life, again, life was becoming more dangerous for Americans in Paris. And so in the middle of 1942, she was interned with all other British and American citizens, and the women were all kept together in a camp in Vittel, which was difficult and interesting. One of her original French translators for Ulysses, who Benoist had become a collaborator, and he saw that she was being imprisoned and pulled some strings, and he managed to get her released. But at that point, she really had to lay low, and so she basically spent the rest of the war kind of hiding out, so that because she was afraid she would be rearrested if the Nazis found her. So in 1944, the Paris fell in August of 1944. And the first person, she was officially liberated by none other than Ernest Hemingway, who was a journalist traveling with the first wave into Paris. And this is the description she has of her welcome into Paris, her meeting with him. There was a lot of shooting going on the Rue de l'Odéon, and we were getting tired of it. And one day a string of Jeeps came up the street and stopped in front of my house. And I heard a deep voice calling, "Sylvia." And everybody in the street took up the cry, "Sylvia, Sylvia." "It's Hemingway," cried Adrienne. And I flew downstairs, and we met with a crash, and he picked me up and swung me around and kissed me while people on the street cheered. In the windows cheered. And later Hemingway and his men rode off to, quote unquote, liberate the wine cellar at the Ritz. And so the picture on the right is of Hemingway and Sylvia Beach and the New Yorker writer Janet Flanner, who was also in this group. After the war, Sylvia Beach did not open her store, and she went to live in that 4th floor apartment that was filled with all of her memorabilia, her books, her manuscripts, her pictures of famous writers. And at that point, she became a celebrity for a new generation of writers. At this point, since Joyce was dead, he had biographers, Leon Adel and Richard Ellman, and also people studying the period, and they flocked to Sylvia Beach to hear her memoirs, and her memories, and she also was lionized. She won awards in England and in France. She got an honorary degree from the University of Buffalo, and she and she also sold them a lot of her manuscripts. But she also had tragedy, which was in 1955. Adrienne Monnier, who had been plagued with Meniere's syndrome, a constant ringing in her ears, which she just couldn't bear, committed suicide. But Sylvia carried on in her in this very kind of wonderful way of people coming to pay homage to her, and she had a new life, and she supported all the new generation of writers coming to Paris. Sylvia Beach died in 1963, probably of a heart attack or a stroke. It's not really being sure. And at that point, after her death, all of her tremendous archives, of which there were, wonderful things, which I've shown you today, were given to the Princeton Library. And my grandmother also donated her papers too. Now, if you visit Paris, you probably know about Shakespeare and Company. You've probably been to the English bookstore that exists today. It's not in the same location. It's on the left bank near Notre Dame. And this is a store that was opened by an expatriate, George Whitman, in the 50s. And Sylvia Beach gave him permission to use her her name and to appropriate the name. And so it exists today. And in fact, I've given a reading there. And so it is still a place where writers gather, and sometimes they've offered beds to people who used to actually live there. And so in a way, it's carrying on this tremendous tradition of English and American writers in Paris being promoted. So that's where I'm going to stop. And here's a little credit, and I would be glad to take any questions that you have.
Carolyn, thank you so much for, first of all, for stepping in on a moment's notice.
My pleasure.
Your talk was terrific. The images you have are wonderful. The ephemera is priceless. As a great fan of Sylvia Beach myself, I covet some of the items, but
I know, we all do, right?
Yes, fortunately they're in safe places, so they'll escape my hands.
Yeah.
One of the things that I thought was very fascinating was Hemingway's library card. And I'm assuming that was kept by Sylvia. And
all of her library cards were kept.
Yeah. So in other words, as various people came in and borrowed, she would then make a record of what they borrowed.
Exactly. She had no kind of proper card system. She just kept records for every single person borrowed. And that is just an incredible resource to see what people were reading. And so Princeton is in the process, they may even have finished it, of digitizing all of those records. And now you can just call it up. So it is, I don't think anyone realized it was going to be such an amazing record, but it is.
Yeah, well, it is. It would be fun to see those. We also have a question about the Society for Suppression of Vice. They seem to be a very active group. And can you tell us a little bit more about them?
Yes, well, there was an original Society for the Suppression of Vice in England. And the Society for the Suppression of Vice was started in 1880 in the United States by somebody we've probably heard of, Comstock, is in the Comstock laws. And their mission was to identify things that they felt were obscene and then bring them to the notice of the law, where they could be confiscated, that the authors could be, or the publishers could be arrested or fined, and certainly having all their books confiscated and destroyed. It went on for a long time. And then a man named John Sumner took over in 1910, and he stayed in power through, he finally retired in the 50s, and then people said at this point, oh, okay, we're not going to do it. But I did go and look up the books that they also confiscated. It was things like Edmund Wilson's Hecate County, and one of the things they absolutely hated was Lady Chatterley's Lover. And not surprisingly, and then Erskine Caldwell, in the 30s and 40s, it's kind of raunchy, it's Southern Gothic. So that was interesting.
Well, yes. Now this is it's interesting hearing Erskine Caldwell's name referenced once again.
Yeah.
Go back to my youth and
yes, finding those books.
finding all those books that were tucked away. This is a particularly rich question. Kevin Birmingham wrote a book that you may know of called The Most Dangerous Book, The Battle for James Joyce's Ulysses. And in his book, he makes the point.
I have two of those, Scandal of Ulysses. I don't know. Yes, I do have a couple of those books, but maybe that is a different.
Well, in this book, he makes the point that the irony is that the book was banned to protect the delicate sensibilities of female readers. Right. But the irony is that the book owes its existence to several women, including Nora Barnacle, Harriet Weaver, who helped fund it. It was serialized.
And what's really funny is that when the little review was brought to court, the first obscenity trial, the judge, and they were trying Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap. The judge wanted to, said this was too delicate for female ears, and he wanted to make them leave the courtroom. And he said, "Well, no, we're on trial here." I mean, it was absurd. Yes, but that's right.
Well, the point of this question is Bennett Cerf gets the credit. The publisher at Random House, he gets the credit for bringing the book to life, but it was all these women who brought the book to life.
I think that's true. I mean, honestly,
There's a real irony.
It is an irony, although I don't think that I think most people know at this point, maybe. I mean, Sylvia Beach for the last 30 years, 40 years has been given the credit she is due for what she did. So, but at the time, you're right, absolutely. And no one, I mean, she was like a footnote, but she definitely has gotten credit. And there've been many, many books written about what women did in the what women did were all the different women that put out these little reviews and promoted people's work. And so I do think that that's been rectified.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there's a wonderful book called Published in Paris by Hugh Ford. And yes. Hugh's premise is that so many people came to Paris not only because it was cheap, but it was also a place where their work could be published. It could not be published in America. And you have organizations like the Society for Suppression of Vice, making certain that those nasty texts aren't exposed to the public. Another person asked the question, did Sylvia Beach have any formal education beyond K-12?
She didn't even have education K-12. She was pretty much tutored at home because of her headaches. She really never even went to conventional school. But I mean, she was an autodidact and incredibly well-read. So
yeah.
But no, she didn't. And in fact, she said something like, about my education, I ain't got none.
Right. Yeah.
So,
right.
Yeah, that was kind of, and Adrienne Monnier had been to the Sorbonne. I mean, she had a proper education, but Sylvia Beach did not.
Yes. Well, again, your talk was terrific. We thank you profoundly for stepping in and taking over with this little glitch. And we'll finish by, I'll finish rather by saying, telling you what one of our attendees said. Thank you. This was wonderful. So thank you, Carol. Thank you. It really was wonderful.
It is a great pleasure for me to bring this story to light, to find, I mean, this has been a family story, but to kind of put it all into sequence. Yes. And with the images and to go through the Princeton papers has been, I love to talk about this subject. So thank you.
Yes. Well, your enthusiasm is evident. And again, we thank you. And now I switch it back to our president, Richard Sheaf.
Wonderful.
Wonderful is the word, Carolyn. Thank you. For me, anyway, unfamiliar as I am with the salons of Paris, this was new ground. What a fabulous and amazing tale. A note to the audience, as announced at the beginning, which perhaps not everybody heard the little bit of a discussion intro to this presentation today. Please, audience, do not use the chat function. Use the Q&A function if you have questions to pose to our speakers. And also, we are not using the raise hand function today. So not chat, not raise hand, please, and thank you. Welcome back. Each year, an important segment of our program is presented by current students, undergraduate, graduate, or even postdoc, who actively use vintage ephemera in their research and their studies. Today, Heidi Herr of Johns Hopkins University and two undergraduate students will address the 19th Amendment and aspects of women's suffrage. Heidi, we are ready.
Great, thank you. Okay. Oops, pardon me, I opened up the wrong thing. Apologies for the technical difficulties. I know that you're all longing to hear about Arushi and Ivy's discoveries using suffrage ephemera, but I first wanted to talk for a few minutes about how we have developed this women's suffrage collection at Hopkins and how we have used it as a learning tool, both within the classroom and for the launch of some successful outreach programs. So a few years ago, the university announced a really exciting initiative called the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commemoration. This was going to be a multi-campus affair in which a suite of programs discussing the women's suffrage movement, as well as voting rights today, were going to be unleashed to the masses, both to the general public and to specific audiences within the Hopkins community. We at the library were asked to create a series of programs that would engage students with research. And this, of course, was a tremendous opportunity. But we had one small problem. We really didn't have within special collections a set of a discrete suffrage collection. What we had instead were a series of books written by suffragists that documented the movement. And while these materials are exceptionally important to historians, they could be a bit daunting to novice researchers. So I had the delightful task of trying to figure out exactly what an ideal suffrage collection would look like for undergraduates. What type of objects, what type of materials would students like to look at? What could they learn from, especially if they have no background at all in American history or the history of women's suffrage, or indeed even skills in analyzing historic material? The answer, of course, was ephemera, because as we all know, ephemera totally rocks. But, ephemera would give us a wonderful indication of the use of popular culture and mass entertainment within the suffrage movement. After all, suffragists in America and the suffragettes in England were very savvy. They knew how to make the most of trends and new technological innovations, from utilizing the Cupid doll for the suffrage cause to figuring out ways to use the new motion picture industry to get their message across. It also too would introduce students to this idea of things going viral, that this isn't an internet phenomenon, but rather something that has happened throughout history. And that things like postcards and buttons and games, all of this suffrage messaging, it could show these students that suffrage was something that people talked about, discussed. There were conversations everywhere regarding whether or not women should vote. And this would also give us a unique and interesting opportunity to look at the use of symbols, slogans, and slang in American and English suffrage ephemera, and to have discussions about whether or not certain symbols and certain types of wordplay are still used today when discussing women's rights. And it was through ephemera that we could have a lot of conversations regarding nuance and resistance. Can these things be interpreted in more than one way? So I spent about 2 years building an ephemera collection. And in the fall of 2019, that was my opportunity to figure out if I was on the right path or not. Fortunately, I was on the correct path. In the fall of 2019, I taught a mini course called Votes and Petticoats. in which a small group of undergraduates at Hopkins had the opportunity to explore our suffrage collection. And the students were just intoxicated from the very first class. They were very interested in these materials, especially things like slogan buttons. Slogan buttons, after all, are still used today for, to either show your allegiance to a particular band or to a particular political cause. And they were shocked to know that these very buttons date back to the 19th century. They also were very intrigued with postcard culture because to them, when they look at postcards, they see memes. And they were able to use the skills they have understanding and interpreting memes to understanding and interpreting vintage postcards. And one of the things that really helped them was how that within meme culture, you may have this stable image, but the meaning of the meme can change based on the caption. So we spent a lot of time talking about that and talking about what that means in terms of suffrage postcards, about whether or not a particular postcard, if it could have a negative context, if there was a way for it to be reclaimed for the suffrage cause. The particular postcard that we're looking at here is a commercial postcard from the 19-teens that was part of what was called a suffragette series, which was a more or less negative comic depictions of suffragettes. And what's very interesting about this particular postcard is the conversations that we had with students. Looking at it, students initially thought that this was a pro-suffrage postcard because to them, they saw a young, determined, fashionably dressed young woman. And they were like, yeah, I want to be her. She looks great. And they also too felt that this particular suffragette looked like a model from an anthropology catalog. So apparently her outfit is very on point among fashionistas. But I then talked to them a little bit about how the suffragette here is shown wearing trousers, wearing overalls, and how this was indicative of perhaps an anti-suffrage message. So we ended up having conversations about dress reform, about what it meant for women to wear clothes that permitted them a full range of activity, and talking too about gender roles and voting, about how those within the anti-suffrage movement were very, very concerned that by the act of voting, women would take on more masculine attributes. So this one postcard opened up an entire plethora of conversations and discussions, the historic context of suffrage in a way that I did not expect. And it was through this conversation that we had with these postcards that students felt ownership and expertise in the subject matter. And as a final project in the class, they had the opportunity to curate a display of women's suffrage postcards in our special collections reading room. And they did such an amazing job that as part of the opening, we had a series of suffrage chats where the student curators spoke to the general public about their topic. We then translated this in-person experience to an online platform. So we now have this lovely Omeka exhibit called Votes and Petticoats, where each student's display is now represented. And one piece of advice I have for anyone who is thinking about starting an ephemera collection for instruction and outreach is to make sure that you have plenty of material featuring cats. As a dog person myself, I must say, I was rather taken aback by how much the students connected with all things cat in the suffrage collection. But as we know, cats have a long lineage in internet culture. And students were talking about some of these suffrage cat postcards in relation to their favorite memes. And this one meme in particular kept on coming up. For those of you who are unaware, it's the woman yelling at cat, which commonly features two of the Real Housewives with a split screen looking at their yelling at a cat who is sitting down to a fine dinner of salad. So some students were connecting the expression of this cat's face to the expression of the cat in the meme. And while this is a rather silly thing, nonetheless, it shows that students are forming these connections. And the fact that they're making these types of silly connections with internet culture shows a genuine interest in ephemera, and it should not be discounted at all. And of course, as part of our instructional outreach, we opened up 2 freshman fellowships to freshmen who were interested in studying women's suffrage. The Freshman Fellows program was started in 2016, and it's meant to give first-year students the opportunity to learn how to conduct research in special collections, and they're partnered with a mentor throughout the process. And I always try to make sure that there's at least one research component that is strong in ephemera. And what I was really thrilled about was how both Ivy and Arushi were so engaged with the material, and how we had conversations to discuss new things to ingest into our collection. And I love this photo of Ivy because she's holding a picture from the masses. And this is a journal that Ivy suggested we acquire. So it was just really fun for us to actually be able to purchase something that she knew would be of use to her research. And really, in a sense, have a legacy that goes beyond the fellowship. So she knows that her research is going to help future students down the road, which is just, totally incredible. In addition to instruction, we also try to do a lot of outreach whenever possible. We have a Hopkins Votes initiative on campus, which is a nonpartisan group who it tries to increase voter registration on campus. So we had postcard giveaways of suffrage postcards, and you can see here one student who registered to vote happily showing off her suffrage cat postcard. And we also had people who are part of the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission. They created a voting booth on the main floor of the library to teach people about the history of voting. And the voting booth design incorporates materials from our women's suffrage ephemera collection. So it's a nice way to kind of point back to what we're doing in special collections while tying it to voting rights today. And finally, this is something that's very important to me. We had a vintage game night. This was the very last thing that we did in person before we were shut down due to COVID. And we had a vintage game night in honor of Women's History Month. And students had the opportunity to come to special collections and play suffrage board games like Pink a Squith, along with some mid-century games like Mystery Date. And we then had discussions as the students were playing these games, talking about what type of impact these games may have had for young girls and women who are playing these games. What type of messaging were they giving about your value as a young person in this world and your place in the world? And how, rather interestingly at times, it was these suffrage games from the 19 teens that were much more progressive than games from the 1950s and the 1960s. And though COVID severely hampered what we could do with suffrage and outreach, I'm proud to say that we were able to utilize features like Zoom to continue to bring women's suffrage ephemera to the fore. We had some teaching experiences in the summer and fall, in which we showcased the collection. We had a special Valentine's Day event where we talked about women's suffrage Valentines. And we also had a special Cooking with Special Collections event in which a student baker recreated a recipe from women's suffrage cookbooks. So all in all, it has just been a really exciting time at Hopkins, and it has really shown me like the power and importance that ephemera can play in student engagement, that there's so much you can do with these ephemera objects, and that students really can forge strong connections and really wish to learn about history through their exposure to ephemera. And indeed, it's students like Ivy who really and truly hearten me when I think about women's suffrage and ephemera. And Ivy is one of our freshman fellows, and she is here to talk about the research that she did in special collections. That's very interesting and very, very timely. Ivy, take it away.
I'll start and share my screen. Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Ivy. I'm a current sophomore at Johns Hopkins University, and I was really lucky last year to be selected as a Special Collections Freshman Fellow. And before I begin, I just want to thank Heidi for her mentorship and just endless support, because none of this research and me exploring this ephemera would have been possible without her. So thank you, Heidi. Yeah, so during my freshman year, I studied Hopkins' collection of women's suffrage ephemera documenting the 19th Amendment and in 1920 and also chronicling the women's suffrage movement in America and across the world. And I'm really excited to share some of my discoveries with you all. So after exploring through the ephemera that we had on the women's suffrage movement, from postcards to newspapers to game boards, I decided to focus my research on the recurrent theme of violence in ephemera, from militant suffragettes smashing windows along London streets as a form of political protest, to the imprisonment of American suffragists outside of DC. There is a long history of violent confrontations with the state and police as a means of political activism, and the fight for the women's right to vote was no exception. And I think this is especially relevant right now, topics around violence and police brutality, given these current demands and calls for justice, and drawing attention to systemic racism that is happening right now and activism happening in the US and globally. So bearing this in mind, when examining instances of violence within the American women's suffrage movement and its most prominent voices, I thought it was important to acknowledge who historically had access to violence as a means of admissible protest in America, and who historically was excluded from such movements. And the American women's suffrage movement in many ways excluded women and activists, writers, artists of color, and it was embedded in the socio-political fabric of the late 19th and 20th century. I wanted to explore how media and art at that time commented on how women ought to act, advocate, and protest on the individual level. How did representations of the right way to protest feed into or deviate from gender norms? And how did these representations discourage or initiate real violent clashes with state authority and police on a structural level? And also taking into account context and different international women's movements that were happening in Britain and places like Norway and China, and also taking into account intersectionality. So these are a set of two satirical poems, books of poems written by Alice Duer Miller. And one is Women Are People, and the other one is Are Women People? And Alice Duer Miller's poems, these were originally published in the New York Tribune, and she often wrote very comical and witty commentary around women's suffrage, and she also critiqued then President Woodrow Wilson. And in these books, she critiques representations of good women suffragists as civil and sweet, that they should all be lovely to each other, that they should all think the same. And so here Miller is exposing a hypocrisy within the suffrage movement, which on one hand is seen as this political revolution and kind of expanding civil rights, but on the other hand, in order to get those rights, different kind of actors in the women's suffrage movement leaned into traditional ideas of femininity and womanhood and gender stereotypes in order to get the vote. This is a speech given by Frances Harper, which is translated or transcribed in a pamphlet that is still awaiting digitization, but it documents the proceedings of the 11th National Women's Rights Convention held in New York in 1866. And this particular piece of ephemera also comments on gender representations, particularly those of white women. So similar to Alice Duer Miller's critiques, Frances Harper counters the notion that women were all delicate and innocent. And according to the transcripts of speeches that she gave, she says that white women aren't, quote, dewdrops exhaled from the skies, but like men, good, bad, indifferent. She also says, quote, if there's any class of people who need to be lifted out of their airy nothings and selfishness, it is the white woman in America. And so we kind of see how femininity in the women's suffrage movement is explored and how that intersects with race and racial tensions. And just a side note on the National Women's Rights Convention in 1866, it was unique because it was a rather peaceful meeting between suffragists and abolitionists, and speakers talked about a wide range of topics, including women's suffrage, but also around women's wages and women's property rights as well. And to kind of put this in context, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, African American women suffragists were rising in prominence, not only in political activism, but also in education and medicine and publishing. But they were still excluded from the movement in many ways, from segregated marches to less cultural and commercial attention. This is a British postcard that shows the aftermath of Bristol students' attack on the WSPU, so the Women's Social and Political Union headquarters. And this demonstration was in retaliation by suffragette militants on the university's pavilion. Periodicals and news articles were also significant avenues of shaping public representations of suffragists and commenting on how suffragists should act. So this is a copy of The Suffragist in our collection. And The Suffragist was a periodical that was published weekly by the Congressional Union of Women Suffrage. And this particular issue ran a feature on suffragists who were being imprisoned in Occoquan Workhouse outside of DC after they were peacefully protesting outside the White House. And in the prison, they were force-fed and beaten by guards. And this issue includes prison notes from a suffragist, Rose Winslow, who writes about the experience, quote, "The feeding gives me a headache, my throat aches afterward, and I always weep and sob to my great disgust, quite against my will." And then near the back of the issue, there is an ad that advertises a picket dinner in honor of our prisoners for freedom. And so I thought this was really interesting because it shows how suffragists were, not only were they subject to different kinds of violence and police brutality, but women's organizations were able to kind of capitalize on these instances and feature them in the press and use it to get more support and use it kind of as a fundraising opportunity. These are some more copies of The Suffragist. The artwork featured in The Suffragist was key to shaping the image of suffrage organizations and public representations of suffragists. Many of the issues of The Suffragist feature cover art from Nina Allender, who, this is not Nina Allender, but this is Lucy Gwynne Burham, who, fun fact, she actually got her master's degree in at Hopkins. But yeah, so the artwork that is done by Nina Allender was often featured in these issues, and she was kind of known for her Allender girl, which is her characteristic portrayal of suffragists as young, capable, and calm protesters. And the Allender girl became almost a symbol of where the women's suffrage movement in America was heading, and her illustrations evoked sympathy for picketing suffragists and were critical of police arrests. And so here we kind of see how poems, speeches, and news stories were continually shaping how suffragists were and ought to be perceived, from deconstructing gender norms to creating counter-representations. Themes of violence and protest were also present in local news. So in an issue of in a 1914 issue of the Baltimore Sun, this documents an instance of violence at a suffrage parade organized by the Congressional Union from Washington. The newspaper mentions a clergyman who was standing on the east side of Holiday Street, and he began to, quote, hiss as soon as the suffragettes began to pass. And obviously this isn't kind of a very inciting incident of violence, but it does kind of show how even though these protests might be portrayed as peaceful, there were different kind of instances of confrontation that were happening on the ground where these suffragists were protesting. And we actually have several pieces in our collection on Baltimore and Johns Hopkins and their connection to the women's suffrage movement. And I actually learned that the Maryland headquarters for the National Women's Party was actually right on North Charles Street. And we looked up where the location for the National Women's Party is, and it's still a building that exists today, and it's now home to the Charles Street Psychic, which is a pretty cool fact. Cheap and popular novels were another way that suffragettes' kind of violent confrontations with the state were decimated. Violence was used as a literary topic for both the suffrage and anti-suffrage movement. This is an anti-suffrage novel about a militant suffragette named Kate Denver, who is imprisoned in Holloway in the novel. And then after she kind of gets out of prison, she, quote, is struck with the hollowness of it all, its inherent feebleness, and realizes she was a fool. So she decides to leave the suffrage movement and marry. And so this novel was an anti-suffrage novel, and Holloway Prison was actually the first female-only prison where British suffragettes were jailed. And novels were a really important way that suffrage commentators tried to influence public opinion around the suffrage cause. And this one in particular seems to react to police brutality and violence and kind of invoke fear and kind of discourage people from joining the movement. There's also a reference to women fighting like cats in this novel. So going back to Heidi's talk about cats and symbolism in the women's suffrage movement. Games were also a way that women's suffrage, kind of different suffrage messaging was presented. So this is an object from our collection from the British suffrage movement, and it's a game board. And these are just kind of close-up shots of different game spaces on the game board. And this game board was called Pankasquith, and it was created by the Women's Social and Political Union, so the WSPU, in 1909. And the colors of their organization are green, yellow, and purple. So you kind of can see a flag peeking out of here and different colors that are on the different spaces. And many of the game spaces actually feature instances of violence, whether it be suffragettes smashing windows, as you can see here, and or protesting along the streets, or confronting police, or kind of rallying in support of suffragettes that were released from Holloway Prison. So here we can see again how women's groups are almost engaging in a kind of political theater, rallying together and using violence committed by and against suffragettes as a tool for fundraising and getting support. Like board games, postcards were also used as a fundraising merchandise by suffrage groups. Suffrage postcards were really popular in the 1900s. People loved to collect them and trade them, and many commercial publishers would create suffrage-themed postcards. This one on the left features suffragettes being carted off to prison, and at the top it says the rest cure, which refers to a medical treatment of bed rest for weeks in isolation, and it was thought at that time to treat mental illness. And so this postcard kind of implies that women who supported women's suffrage was like an illness. And I thought this was really interesting because it kind of shows how politics and medicine intertwine in like the medicalization of these different political ideas. And the postcard on the right features a suffragette who appears in the distance, and then this kind of guy in the forefront who says, "Just take it from me, never try to tell a heavyweight suffragette, the reason she shouldn't be allowed to vote. And this isn't an image of like police brutality, but it does kind of speak to how suffragettes were capable of fighting back. And also this does also relate to ideas around femininity and what that looks like, and this kind of using masculine features to describe suffragettes was also a way, a kind of a messaging that was used by the anti-suffrage movement. And so through postcards, the women's suffrage movement was incorporated into the economy as well. And it was a way that allegiances were expressed and allyship was sold through purchasing postcards. And in Heidi's class, actually, one really fun kind of activity that we did when we were looking at the postcards was reading the messages that people wrote on the back and letters that people sent to each other. And oftentimes it wasn't even about suffrage at all. So I thought that was really interesting in how these suffrage postcards were able to normalize conversations around women's suffrage and anti-suffrage in ways that probably wouldn't have been possible without these postcards. This is another British postcard, and it features a suffragette sitting in a tree, and she is taking advantage of a train breakdown to lob a bomb. And one note that I thought is important about these British postcards is that they mostly featured suffragettes that were white women and were largely consumed by white women as well. Okay, so context is really important, and it's just important to note how the women's suffrage movement was happening internationally, and there were also instances of racism and nativism. Black press, like the crisis, was really critical in shaping public opinion on the 19th Amendment. This is an image of the crisis, and it was a magazine that was affiliated with the NAACP, and it provided African American readers with coverage on the women's suffrage movement, and it would run editorials and opinion pieces for pro and anti-suffrage. And one interesting fact is that Hopkins alum Kelly Miller actually penned an article in the crisis arguing that giving African American men the right to vote was different than giving women the right to vote, and having women in public office was risky. And so I thought it was really interesting how Kelly Miller, who was an educated and prominent Black leader, was using some of the arguments that people against women's suffrage were using. Black women were also forming their own suffrage groups in response to kind of certain kinds of exclusion that were happening in predominantly majority white suffragist organizations. So one prominent Black women's organization was the Illinois Federation of Colored Women's Club. And Ida B. Wells, a famous suffragist and advocate for civil rights, was a speaker. And during the 1911 Federation meeting, she gave a talk to Frances Watkins, Harper Watkins. And so this is kind of the, I guess, a pamphlet that features the meeting. And Ida B. Wells also traveled to Britain actually and held meetings against lynching and in an effort to influence the American press. And we kind of see the internationality of these different topics coming to light related to women's activism. This is actually one of my favorite pieces in the collection. It is a ephemeral pamphlet, and it's an underground pamphlet, and it is from China, and it memorializes Tuojing, who was a Chinese revolutionary writer and poet, and she criticized arranged marriages and foot binding, and she advocated for better schooling for women in early 20th century China. She was also skilled in horseback and sword fighting, which is pretty cool. And the very printing of this pamphlet was very risky, and I just loved kind of looking through it. And in the back there is a 1922 paid San Francisco stamp from a San Francisco Chinese grocer. And I thought it was really interesting, and I really kind of imagined the ways on how this pamphlet could kind of land itself in San Francisco, and it kind of shows the purchasing kind of habits of people in San Francisco, and like people immigrating to the US, and also how interconnected and international the women's suffrage and feminist movements were. This is a kind of booklet collection that covers suffrage claims and evidence, and it was designed for American suffrage speakers and writers to use in debates. And it would have kind of little claims and then possible arguments, you could say, if someone makes those claims. And I thought this was really interesting because as I was looking through the arguments, I noticed that there were certain arguments, for example, like nativist arguments that were being made to advance women's suffrage. So for example, here, do you know what extending suffrage to women, do you know that extending suffrage to women increases the number of native-born voters? And it also references kind of women's suffrage movements happening in other countries like Scandinavia, Norway, Finland. Yeah, I just thought this was really interesting because, again, the woman's right to vote is seen as extending civil freedoms and liberties, but at the same time, a lot of it was advanced through nativist or other racist fears, and I thought there was a really interesting contradiction there. This is the masses, which I was holding in the photo that Heidi introduced, and it features humorous essays, poems, and news, and many of them relating to the suffrage movement. And what I found really interesting was in this issue of the masses, it covers a woman on trial who was on trial for dispersing pamphlets in different languages on birth control methods in other countries. And I thought this was really interesting because it shows how the American women's suffrage movement wasn't simply just about the vote, but it also connected to broad-based reforms that were happening that relate to women's issues as a whole and are still very relevant today. Okay, so some concluding thoughts. Before this project, I had mostly understood the American women's suffrage movement as being very peaceful and peaceful protests, and then a peaceful passage of the 19th Amendment. But what I learned through my research and looking at the ephemera was how there were real and significant instances of violence and brutality and confrontation. And I'm still learning how incredibly complex the movement was and the ways that it kind of leaned into or deviated from gender norms, and how it excluded and also gave rise to activists of color. And the movement was full of different opinions, often contradictory opinions, on how it ought to be approached, and it used different means from commercialized postcards to organization-sponsored press to advance its cause. And ultimately, the ephemera that we collect and that I was lucky enough to be able to look at and explore bears witness to all of this complexity. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. And I just loved the experience of exploring the ephemera that we had in our collection and being a part of this fellowship program.
Thank you so much, Ivy. And I have to say that when Ivy mentioned that we discovered the location of the National Women's Party's headquarters in Baltimore, I was actually in the reading room at the time, and so was Arushi, our next speaker. So Ivy was looking at issues of the suffragist, and she found the address, and I, of course, looked it up online. And we were all so excited to find out that the building still existed and that it was a psychic's place. And we have plans, we have a future date. Once we're all back on campus, we're going to go to the Charles Street Psychic and see if we can commune with the spirits of, Baltimore suffragists. So that was just a fun, whimsical time with ephemera in our reading room last year. So next up is going to be Arushi Krishnan, who looked at the women behind the anti-suffrage movement. Arushi, unfortunately, is in class today, so she couldn't make it, but she did record her presentation, and I am so happy to be able to share it with you. And I will do so right now.
Hello, my name is Arushi Krishnan, and I'm a sophomore at the Johns Hopkins University. Through my university, I was lucky enough to have a fellowship where I studied the suffrage movement. My concentration was in the anti-suffrage movement, and in particular, the women of the anti-suffrage movement, their lives, and the motivations of voting against suffrage. If I could, I would like to start by having us imagine something. Imagine this day in history viewed 100 years from now. Think of the lives we live and our policies and rules and how they will be viewed by future generations. What would they think about it? They would ask us how we could possibly think the way we did. How could we imagine what we were doing is right? Well, 100 years ago from today was the passage of the 19th Amendment. It was a landmark in American governance. For the first time in the nation's history, equal voting laws were given to men and women, giving us equal footing. It was a day of triumph for sure, but not all were celebrating. Outside government buildings, in schools, in streets, in homes, there were protests. These protests were led by the infamous anti-suffrage movement, and they weren't happy. The anti-suffragists were quite a diverse bunch, consisting of individuals from all walks of life. Though the affluent bumped shoulders with the indigent, and the learned spoke in the same commons as the uneducated, they all had the same goal: to ensure that amendment of equality of the ballot would not be passed. One of the main reasons for the prominence of the anti-suffrage movement was due to their efficiency in pushing their ideals. They did so by using forms of media that could be quickly made and shared: posters, buttons, and other forms of ephemera. And as would be expected, the ephemera wasn't made to last, but rather to convey a message as succinctly as memorably as possible. The anti-suffragists, or the antis as they were called, were skilled ephemera makers, as they understood the pivotal rule of advertising. In order to strike a chord with the general public, we must unite them against a common enemy, and they found the enemy in the suffragists. During my research, the vast majority of anti-suffrage ephemera I have seen revolves around pulling down the suffrage movement, rather than justifying their own actions and beliefs. This is a common tactic that is still in use today. If you take a look at hate groups, contemporary propaganda, and other forms of unjustifiable bigotry, you'll find quite a lot of finger pointing without much justification. The anti-suffragists were able to gain a sizable amount of clout through their sometimes questionable methods. In fact, it would have been quite possible that the 19th Amendment would have been passed much earlier if it were not for the zeal and tact displayed by the anti-suffragists. They were able to whip up masses of people into a frenzy of fury, stirring dissent among family and friends. The amount of people who were against women getting the power to vote was an alarmingly high number. And that is perhaps even more alarming, considering that a sizable amount of these people were themselves women. The women who are part of the anti-suffrage movement intrigues me endlessly. Why would one want to vote against their own interest to basically deny themselves equality? I was surprised to uncover a plethora of reasons, plenty of which were quite unexpected to me. Personally, I feel that a lot of the female anti-suffragists held onto the beliefs largely due to the sheer force of inertia. They were used to not voting, and the novelty of doing so presented them with a foreign type of mystery. They were swayed easily by the antis because the movement reflected their upbringing and their own beliefs, the values they held on to all their lives, essentially. It was easy to turn a blind eye to the benefits of suffrage because they were raised blind. But that wasn't the only rationale behind the suffrage movement. Quite a few learned, educated women were proud anti-suffragists, and they held on to jobs and wielded power, but they still were against universal suffrage. The rationale was that since they already had power and were successful, well-established members of society, they had no real use for the ballot. This is not only counterintuitive for their own gains, but also marginalized women who weren't in the same social strata as them and were forced to fight for the basic rights. these women didn't think as far as that. They held meetings, distributed badges and buttons, and used their platform to air their anti-suffrage views. Women such as Josephine Dodge, president of the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, daughter of the minister to US Russia, and Englishwoman Kathleen Ansley, prominent children's book author whose books were sold in both the United Kingdom and the United States, were effectively able to use their fame to push their ideas onto the public. Ansley, for example, wrote a book featuring her popular wooden doll characters, where it depicted the suffrage movement in a negative light. The ephemera used by them was wildly successful, and the movement initially had numbers on the side. More men with anti-suffragist views cast votes to prohibit increasing enfranchisement at 295,939 than votes were ever cast to any political parties during elections at the time, 278,976, which were votes cast for Massachusetts during the Republican nominee in 1896. Viewing the ephemera with a modern mind sheds interesting light on the mindsets of people back in the early 20th century. A lot of the anti-suffrage ephemera seems quite pro-suffrage to the modern viewer, and vice versa as well. Another interesting group of people who existed during this time were those who chose to remain neutral. Much like the pro and anti-suffragists, this group consisted of people of all walks of life, and were also a surprisingly vocal group. Ephemera from this third group is created as well, and some of it has survived the destruction of time and still can be viewed today. And finally, the fourth elusive group, a member which can be seen during all conflict of human history, the group who is there to make a profit. These people pandered to both sides of the struggle, selling ephemera to both. Such a strategy can also be employed by suffrage advocacy groups in the hope that they would convert people to their cause. Consumer culture boomed during the early age of suffragism, and activist groups created amusing ephemera for fundraising. Postcards were popular with both the pro and anti-suffrage crowd. Postcards have been found with the exact same illustration, yet one shows pro-suffrage views and the other shows anti. For me, it shows that one of the classic traits that can be seen from all humans: conflicts come and go. It is important to remember and to protect humanity before anything else. The path to suffrage was a long one, with a journey that lasted almost 100 years, and quite a lot of views were changed during that time. Some anti-suffragists saw what suffrage offered them and changed their mindsets, and unfortunately, some suffragists started following anti-suffrage ways. Take Phoebe Cousins, for example. She was a trailblazer and an ardent feminist, being one of the first female lawyers in the United States. For the first part of her life, she was a staunch suffragette, attending rallies, giving speeches, and distributing pamphlets, stating the benefits of universal suffrages that would be given to all women. Then, around 1897, her views shifted. She publicly renounced the anti-suffrage movement. She publicly denounced the pro-suffrage movement, becoming an anti-suffragist, deciding that women didn't need the right to vote at all. Bizarrely, she joined the United Brewers Association and used her platform to preach her now anti-suffrage views. She stated that she was disappointed by the methods carried out by the suffragists and believed they would take them nowhere. She died an anti and was no longer given any recognition by the suffragettes. The anti-suffrage movement is undeniably overjoyed by the change of events and boasted about how they were able to turn suffragists even as prominent as Cousins. The Cousins never explicitly called herself an anti-suffragist. She followed their views and completely turned her back to the suffrage movement. It is also important to remember that the suffrage movement wasn't as squeaky clean as some history books proclaim. Many prominent suffragettes, including Elizabeth Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Phoebe Cousins herself, were against the 15th Amendment, which prohibited a denial to vote based on race and previous servitude. All of them, Stanton especially, were known to publicly air their disdain towards the amendment. The irony seemingly escaped them, that they were proud of their fight for equality. They didn't want complete equality. Maybe spurred by this, there were a growing group of African-American women who were against suffrage. They felt so ostracized by the suffragettes that they would rather not have their rights than belong to the group. Also, thanks to the 15th Amendment, African American men were allowed to vote. So they were satiated with the fact that they were given some sort of representation, no matter how small or indirect. It is important to note that the racist views of some of the suffragettes also extended voting rights and perceived privileges that the non-white male immigrants had in the United States, especially in states like California that had prominent Asian American communities. The anti-suffrage women were incredibly proud of how feminine they were. They loved proving how matronly and caring they were, with ephemera often showing them as dainty and well-dressed, always doting over their loyal husbands or litter of children. This is how real women act, they meant to say, and real women don't need the right to vote. And to contrast this, they portrayed the suffragettes as brutish, man-like creatures with dowdy faces and unflattering clothes. They were loveless, sexless creatures who so craved to have the same attributes as men that they were slowly turning into men themselves. They also showed the suffragettes as flighty and airheaded, whose stances could shift at the drop of a hat. And on the flip side, they depicted the male suffragists as spineless feminine beings who were so beat down by their suffragette spouses that they were forced to pick up all of their wives' duties. They essentially took on the role of the wife, since their own incredibly masculine wives were off voting all day long. My research into the women who opposed the suffrage movement gave me insights into part of American history which I had never seen before. I learned of triumph and struggles, both big and small. I learned the power of suggestion. I learned of the lives of the women who lived so many generations before me, and how the shockwaves of the decisions can still be felt today. It is a lovely thing to feel connected to the bygone days through powerful bits of history, to touch items handled by the very same women so very long ago. We will be nothing if we don't learn from history, and I am glad I'm able to pay homage to the women who fought for my right and to the rights of women all over the country. Thank you so much for listening to me today. Attached is my contact information, and I hope you have a lovely day.
Well, what a heartening afternoon for ephemera. We have heard from two very established scholars and students of ephemera in Lisa and Carolyn. We've heard from a woman completing her PhD in Jenny. And now we see undergraduates engaged in studying ephemera and learning the ways in which ephemera can tell us things about culture and about history. So we do have a number of questions, and Heidi and Ivy, if you would please activate, and you can receive our accolades and our thanks. And Arushi, we wish you were here as well. Both of your talks were just terrific. We have had the Young Scholars Program in place, I think now for 6 years, and it keeps getting more and more active and diffuse and broad-ranged. And I would say to anybody who is a participant today, if you are involved in academic programs, if you're a student, if you're faculty, staff, take the message of ephemera to your students and to younger collectors. So one of the first questions refers to the rhetoric of in ephemera. And you know, a lot of 19th century ephemera can be very dense in terms of the rhetoric. And the question was, and Ivy, you addressed this in your talk, but Heidi, I guess this is for you as well, and that is, how do you get the students to engage in the rhetoric, or is it a combination of engaging with image as well as the rhetoric associated with that piece of ephemera? Does that question make sense? So which of you would like to address it?
I'll start and then Ivy can correct me from a student perspective. But one of the things that I did in preparation for kind of teaching students was really learn about the slang of the era. And once I felt that I was competent in knowing that calling, you know, someone a panko doesn't mean you're calling somebody a breadcrumb, I kind of felt that I could create some learning activities for students to get to talking about this. And one of the things that we talked about in terms of kind of like dense language and symbols and all of that, was all of the wordplay surrounding suffer, like suffragette, suffer. And the whole entire thing about I'm a suffragette instead of I'm a suffragette. And we kind of talked about all of this wordplay. And I was then able to find postcards that engaged in this very wordplay, as well as an actual postcard where the postcard writer was using these slang so that students could relate to it and realize that I wasn't being wacky Heidi talking to them about pinkos and suffragettes and all that. So part of it was just doing a lot of research on my part to make sure that we had a collection that addressed some of these like dense, strange rhetoric of the past, and then giving students activities and tools so they could fully appreciate what was going on with these images. Ivy, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said. And I was actually pleasantly surprised by a lot of the texts that I read and like I guess how readable they were. I guess I thought that there would be more kind of rhetoric that I didn't understand than that I actually did. And I would say that the images and especially like on the postcards can reinforce a lot of the rhetoric, and you can kind of figure out some of the meanings behind the rhetoric through the images.
Yeah, that's interesting because it also brings up, I think, a question that was submitted, and it has to do with collection development. Going forward, I mean, you clearly had a topic this year that you could address, but going forward with developing the ephemera collection at Hopkins, what do you envision that collection becoming, or what's your vision for adding to the collection? I guess Heidi, that would apply to you, but Ivy, you might have some insight in this also.
So I'll start and then Ivy can take it away. So I do love collecting ephemera for special collections, and I do intend to continue building on our women's suffrage ephemera, in particular trying to address some gaps in our collection or enhancing certain subtopics that we have within the ephemera. The next thing that I intend to do, and I'm very excited about, is to really expand on our cookery collection. We have a great collection of cookbooks, and students absolutely adore researching these cookbooks. And I thought it'd be fun, for instance, to teach a class on historic cookbooks where students actually help to select ephemera to bring into the collection. So things like menus or food-themed trade cards. So I think ephemera offers us a nice opportunity to bring students into collection development. Ephemera, it can be affordable. We can kind of create a budget. Students are really interested in looking at these things. And I think that it's a fine way to make students feel like they're part of special collections, because far too often students feel as though it's not for them, that they don't have the understanding or the background, or they may not even see themselves represented in these collections. But it's through ephemera that we can indeed kind of capture their interests and really and truly make them feel involved in the future of special collections. So I'm really looking forward to collaborating with students in the future to strengthen what we currently have.
Ivy?
Yeah, I guess just adding on to Heidi, I think I'm really excited for like all of the current special collections freshman fellows and future fellows and like their interests in expanding the ephemera that we have at special collections at Hopkins. And I definitely agree, a lot of the ephemera that I find most engaging are the ones that are kind of interactive, like the game boards or the playing cards and different card games. I know in the class I took with Heidi, we had a game night, like she mentioned, and we played suffrage games, and that was a really interesting and engaging way for us to like think about how suffrage messaging was presented, and it was also just really fun to play suffrage games.
Well, it's interesting too, Heidi, you mentioned the collection of cookbooks, and you said students seem to be interested in those cookbooks. Well, if current undergraduates are anything like I was as an undergraduate, they're constantly hungry. So, of course, they would probably be interested in cookbooks. Another one of our guests asks, is the Suffrage exhibit available on Hopkins Library website? And I guess that would be you, Heidi.
Oh, excuse me. Yes, it is. So the exhibit Votes and Petticoats is available on the library website. There should be, I believe, like an exhibitions tab within the website, and you can locate it there. And in addition, the majority of our ephemera, women's suffrage ephemera collection is digitized, and we have it in a Flickr album. So people can explore the album, and they can also download the images and repurpose them for their own research.
Yeah, good. So Heidi, I guess this question is one that you should answer. And that is, are you becoming an ephemera collector? And are others of your classmates becoming ephemera collectors?
Oh, me? Ivy?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I said Heidi, I meant Ivy.
Yeah.
Ivy. Are you becoming an ephemera collector?
Honestly, I suppose yes. Like I am collecting kind of pieces of ephemera in the present that, like pins or clippings or tickets to certain events. I I know that at Hopkins they reprinted a suffrage cookbook, and I really enjoyed looking through that. And yeah, so I suppose yes.
Good. Keep doing it, because someday you'll be like so many of us in this group, and you'll look back and you'll see your life unfolding in front of you through ephemera. This has been a wonderful and rich presentation. Heidi, you are to be commended for the work you did. Ivy and Arushi, your talks were terrific. And I'd like to end with one comment that was submitted. And that is, we listened to Heidi and Ivy and Arushi with tears of pride and hope. With instructors like Heidi and young people like Ivy, America is in good hands for the future, thanks to them and the ESA. And thank you so much for your involvement. And it has been a terrific afternoon. So I go back to our president, Richard Schief.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, and everybody, obviously. And Heidi, we thank you especially for your initiative and your enthusiasm. And Ivy and Arushi, it is really heartening to we ephemerists to learn of a top-notch university archive setting out to specifically collect items of ephemera, and also to see such thoughtful and intelligent student analysis. Folks, we've reached the end of today's presentations. Your Ephemera Society hopes that you have found it time well spent. Thank you so much for joining with us, and please be with us again tomorrow for 4 new presentations beginning at 12 noon Eastern. By the way, we will soon have today and tomorrow's presentations posted for viewing anytime on our website, ephemerasociety.org, probably next week. Meanwhile, online tomorrow beginning at noon Eastern, not tomorrow, beginning Saturday, I'm sorry, I've mixed up 2 notes, but beginning Saturday, at noon Eastern, Marvin, our promoter, will serve up the largest virtual gathering of ephemera dealers ever assembled anywhere, with hundreds of fine offerings for your consideration. And as a special benefit, early preview admission will be made available only for members of the Ephemera Society. So if you don't happen to be a member and you would like early admission, kindly become a member between now and tomorrow evening, or tomorrow afternoon when the notices go out, because the early viewing will begin tomorrow evening after our conference presentations have been completed for the day, but before the official public opening of the show on Saturday. So it's well worth doing. From your Ephemera Society and from all of our fine presenters today, good evening.